Possessed by a Dark Warrior, Eternal Mate's Paranormal Romance Series, Book 9, written by Felicity Heaton, narrated by Eric G. Dove. Chapter 24. Blue scoured the lands around him. Villages dotted the rolling green hills, marked by the windmills and golden fields of grains that often surrounded them. Taryn would avoid those and any hint of civilization. He looked over his right shoulder in the direction of the first realm of the demons, towards the stronghold. He doubted she would return to the dragon realm and her brother, but he couldn't be sure. He scanned back around, sweeping his gaze over all the lands to his right, and then settling them on the mountain range that separated the elf kingdom from the free realm and the others. Would she have kept flying straight and true towards those mountains, or would she have swept around to head back towards Tenak? He couldn't see her in any direction, not a single sign of her. He would find her, though. He couldn't let her disappear from his life again, and he wouldn't leave her out there to go through whatever was hurting her alone, not when he knew he could help her. Blue closed his eyes and focused on his blood and their incomplete bond. He turned his thoughts inwards at first, seeking the thread that connected them, and seized hold of it. The slender ribbon of red shimmered in the darkness of his mind, and he focused on it, using his psychic abilities to enhance and strengthen it until it glowed. He wavered on his feet, strength draining from him, but he pushed onwards, pouring all of his energy and his power into locating her. The darkness faded, hazy black rock replacing it, cragged and grim. He frowned and pushed harder, forcing the images to focus so he could discern where she was. Long minutes passed, a tiny span of time in the life of an elf, but one that felt like an eternity to him. He needed to find her. He needed to be with her. The image came into sharp relief. A cave. He clung to that image and teleported, willing himself to go to that location. The darkness swallowed him, and when it parted, the cold that had engulfed him didn't go away. Frigid wind battered him, scouring his bare torso with icy fingers, stealing all heat from him. He shivered and wrapped his arms around himself and scanned his surroundings. The cragged black rock dropped sharply below him, plummeting into a valley before it rose up again into another sharp peak. Similar mountain ranges filled the distance as far as he could see. The western border of the elf kingdom. This was no place for his female. This patch of no man's land between the elf kingdom and the realms beyond was dangerous. The battles between the fallen angels and gods that took place in those lands often spilling over into it. He needed to get Taryn away from this place. He looked across to his right as wind whistled past him, the wailing noise created by the cave mouth there. Taryn's fear continued to flow through his blood, stronger now that she was close to him again. His little dragon had been afraid, and her instincts had driven her to find a cave, a place where she could hide. He curled his hands into fists at his sides, turned on his heel, and strode towards the isolated cave. He wasn't sure what to expect as he stooped and entered the cave, his eyes adjusting to the near darkness. But seeing Taryn huddled naked in the corner, holding herself and rocking, hit him square in the chest, in the heart. Blue couldn't stop his feet from carrying him to her, or his instincts as her male from teleporting a blanket from his quarters and into his hand, together with a small battery-operated lantern. He twisted the top to turn it on, and pale light chased back the darkness. Taryn looked up at him through the tangled strands of her violet-to-white hair, her eyes bloodshot and wide, tears streaking her cheeks together with a smear of blood that darted upwards from the right side of her mouth, and his heart ached behind his breast. She tensed when he stopped in front of her. He slowly crouched before her, set the lantern down, and carefully placed the blanket around her shoulders. "What is wrong?" he whispered in her tongue, his voice as soft as he could manage when part of him was filled with fury, with a dark hunger to seek out whoever had harmed her and make them suffer as she did. He focused on tending to her instead, using it to keep that hunger under control. She was all that mattered right now. He drew the blanket closed around her while he waited for her to become accustomed to his presence and find her voice. When she didn't speak, he carefully combed her hair with his fingers, removing the crusted blood. Blood that was his fault. He had hurt his mate, and he had to live with that. But he didn't have to let her suffer now, when he had the power to help her, heal her. Since the dark moment 42 centuries ago when Veil and Fury had shattered his world, he had built a wall around his heart, determined to never allow anyone into it again. He had refused to feel deeply for anyone. He had kept them all at arm's length, so he wouldn't be hurt again. He had purged all weakness because he had wanted to be strong, invulnerable. He had done his best to guard himself and his heart, and it had worked for so long. Or so he had thought. When he had seen Taryn again, and as he looked at her now, he realized that he hadn't been invulnerable. He had only been in denial. He had carried pain for 4,000 years, letting it fester in his heart, and those open sores had allowed darkness to grow inside him. That darkness made him more vulnerable and weaker than ever, susceptible to it. He had refused to deal with what had happened to him, had convinced himself that it hadn't hurt him or affected him in any way, and now it might ruin him. He could feel the darkness inside him, a terrible living thing that Tenak had set free, and that he was still struggling to control even now. Taryn's eyes locked with his, soft and tender despite the hurt he could sense in her, the fear and the despair, and gently cast the shadows from his heart, expelling them and cleansing him. If anyone in this world could help him come to terms with his emotions and the things that had happened in his past, it was her. It had always been her. She had held back the darkness inside him from the moment he had met her. He knew that now as he looked down at her, his fingers tangled in her hair, feeling her warmth on his skin. She had given him purpose, and he had mistaken it for a mission, conditioning himself to view her as nothing more than an enemy, because he had been too afraid to risk his heart. He wasn't afraid anymore. This feeling inside him wasn't a weakness. It didn't make him vulnerable. It made him strong. He was falling in love with her, with his mate, and he would do whatever it took to make her fall in love with him, too. He would do whatever it took to make her see that he could be a good male, the right male for her if she would give him a chance, that he cared about her above everything else and would never let anything happen to her. He would protect her, cherish her, would love her forever if she let him. He brought his fingers closer to her cheek and frowned as he felt her trembling. His little dragon was suffering, and he would do for her what he knew she could do for him. He would do his best to take away that pain by helping her come to terms with her emotions and her past. "He is coming," she murmured, and began rocking, eyes darting beyond him to the cave mouth and back again. Blue nodded and kneeled in front of her. She caught the edges of the thick black wool blanket and tugged it closed, clutching it so tightly her fingers paled. "You saw him in a vision," he said in a low voice, the most soothing one he could manage. At least he hoped it was soothing. He didn't have much experience with this sort of thing. He wasn't sure he had ever taken care of anyone. Not like this. Not even his little sister. She slowly nodded, and her eyes leaped back to him. "They only come when you are near." He frowned. "Me?" She nodded again. His presence triggered her visions. She had mentioned that she had limited magic because Tenak had received most of it. He had thought that meant she couldn't have visions, but she could, when he was near to her. As much as he wanted to know more, he had to focus on her and not satiating his curiosity. He would ask about it later, after he had calmed her and eased her fear. "Are you afraid because your brother is coming?" he said, and her eyes darted back up to his. They dulled. She rubbed her wrists and began rocking harder, and he turned his frown on them. Her slender fingers unerringly followed the lines of the scarring around her wrists. His eyes dropped to the matching scars around her ankles, and then jumped up to the ones around her throat. He cursed in the elf tongue, the foulest one at his disposal. It had been being placed in captivity that had terrified her. Gods, he was going to kill Leif and the others. He was going to hunt down whoever had placed shackles on his beautiful female and destroy them. "Taryn," he husked, and she blinked, her eyes brightening again, but not enough to satisfy him. They were still distant. She was still locked in her thoughts, caged by her memories. He reached out to touch her hand, and she flinched away and snarled at him through teeth that were now all sharp points. He withdrew and held his hands up at his sides, showing her that he meant her no harm. "You know me." He couldn't bring himself to add that he wasn't going to hurt her, because he had hurt her just hours ago, and in her current state she was liable to remind him of that. He wasn't sure he could bear hearing her say what he had done, not when merely thinking about it left him raw inside, hollowed out and sick to his stomach. "I know you," she murmured and canted her head, causing her hair to brush her right cheek. She frowned. "If I know you, why do I not know your name?" Her eyes darkened and her lips flattened, and the sense of power she always emanated grew stronger, rising to a level where his instincts warned she was a danger and was about to attack him. "You are a liar," she snarled, and her eyes shone vivid violet and white, almost glowing in the low light. He couldn't argue against that. He had lied a hell of a lot in his lifetime, to people he cared about, to her, and to himself. "I never told you my name," he said, and forced himself to remain relaxed even as his instincts roared to prepare for a fight. Her eyes narrowed. Silence stretched between them, thickening the air in the cave as he waited to see what she would do. She remained tensed, coiled, and prepared to strike. His heart beat harder, pumping blood to his muscles as his body disobeyed him and he readied himself. If she attacked, he wouldn't fight back. He would defend himself and find a way to calm her, because he felt sure that she would feel terrible when the past lost its grip on her and she realized what she had done. Just as he felt terrible that he had hurt her while lost in the darkness. She finally eased back, the tension flowing from her and from him at the same time. He let out the breath he had been holding and sank back onto his heels. "What is your name, Elf?" "My name is Blue," he said, and sat still while she studied him, raking her eyes over his bare torso and his leather-clad legs, right down to his knees where they were pressed into the black ground before she pulled them back up to his face. He would answer whatever question she posed to him, no matter what it was, or whether it made him feel vulnerable, exposed to her. He would do that for her. He would make himself vulnerable so she wouldn't feel alone. He needed to do it, and it had nothing to do with his instincts as her mate, and everything to do with his growing feelings for her. Her dull eyes flitted over his face, and a hint of a smile touched her lips. "You are beautiful. But that is your most terrible weapon. I have seen the other side of that beauty." She caressed the left side of her throat. Blue looked away, pinning his eyes on the ground beside her. "And I have apologized for what I did to you, but not well enough." He sighed, pulled down another breath, and lifted his head, locking gazes with her again. She needed to hear it, and he had to stop trying to hide his feelings from everyone, from her. It was time he allowed someone into his heart. "I am sorry, Taryn." He reached out and brushed the blanket aside, revealing the ravaged side of her throat, and stared at it, his heart throbbing madly behind his breast. "I should not have hurt you like that. I should never have hurt you at all. I cannot excuse what I have done, and I do not expect you to forgive me for it. Condemn me. Do whatever you must to punish me for what I did to you. I deserve only that. I deserve your retribution." Her face softened, eyes leaping between his, clearer now. "You wish for me to punish you because you did something I did not like? Because you disobeyed me?" He frowned at the words she had chosen and the way the brightness in her eyes faded again. Her breathing came quicker, his heart racing in time with hers, and her pain and fury flowed through him like ice and fire, numbing him and making him burn at the same time. "I am not like them. Do not ever think I am like them," she snarled and knocked his hand away, her expression darkening as she flashed sharp teeth at him. "I will not punish you for something you did that displeased me." Displeased, disobeyed. She began rubbing her wrists again, frantically scouring them with her fingers. "Taryn," He reached for her. She shot to her feet, the blanket falling away from her to pool at her ankles, and he looked up at her. She towered over him in the dimly lit cave, naked and beautiful, but terrifying too. Darkness reigned in her eyes, the same madness that he had seen in them back when she had stopped her brother from killing him on the mountainside. He was losing her to her memories. "Taryn," he whispered, and her eyes narrowed on him. "I take it back. I do not want you to punish me. I want you to love me," he thought. It beat in his heart with every powerful thump, ran in his veins like a relentless wave, and he couldn't deny that desire as it filled him, opened his eyes and stripped away his strength, tearing down the barriers around his heart and leaving it open to her, vulnerable. He had never felt so weak, so afraid. It felt as if his very existence depended on the female towering over him. She started shaking her head, her eyes widening and her fear flooding the link between them. Her hands came up and she shoved her fingers into her hair, dragging it back from her face. He rose onto his feet and she backed away from him, still shaking her head, her fine eyebrows rising high. Gods! He had meant to comfort her and he had only made it worse. She had to speak with him. She had to tell him about what haunted her, or he would only keep making mistakes with her. "I do not want to be punished," she mumbled and looked down at her feet. "I do not want it." He reached for her and she lashed out at him, catching him across his left pectoral with her claws. He leaped back when she snarled, baring her fangs at him. Blood trickled down his chest. "Keep away! Do not touch me!" She backed away from him again, until she hit the rear wall of the cave and couldn't move any further. She tossed a panicked look beyond him to the cave mouth. No, he couldn't let her run away again. He sidestepped and blocked her path. She threw a pained glance at him and her face crumpled. "Please do not punish me. I did not mean to escape the cage, but I had to fly." "I know," he whispered and held his hands up, hoping to calm her. "I will not punish you, Taryn. But someone did. Who punished you?" Because he wanted a name, something he could go on, something he could punish for her. Her eyes turned wild. "The first was a mortal. He was not strong enough to hold me. He was not strong enough to break me." "The first?" Blue snarled, darkness curling through him, driving back the light. "How many have tried to hurt you, Taryn?" "Tried?" she whispered and blinked. And gods, he wanted to hold her when she looked at him like that, the truth shining in her striking eyes. The bastards hadn't tried to hurt her. They had hurt her. He stepped towards her, his bare chest heaving as he struggled to keep control and keep his voice smooth and calm so he didn't frighten her. "Tell me their names." She blinked again, her eyes darted around and her fear jacked up, panic and frustration joining it. She shook her head and looked at him. "I do not know their names." "Gods damn it." "Then tell me what you do know. Give me something I can use, so I can make them pay for the things they did to you." He reached for her again and backed off when she flashed those killer-sharp teeth at him, warning him away. He knew she needed her space, but it was hard to hold himself at a distance when he wanted to draw her into his arms and hold her to comfort her. Her eyes locked with his, clearer again now. "You swear you will make them pay?" He nodded. Her pretty face blackened. "You will kill them?" He didn't hesitate. "I will slaughter them for you." She took a step towards him. "There are 6 of them." "6 is nothing. I can kill 6 with a mere thought. I will crush them and I will make sure they know they died because they hurt you." Her violet to white eyes leaped between his. "Why would you do this for me?" Because he loved her. Gods, he loved her. He could embrace the darkness inside him if it meant avenging her. He wouldn't hesitate. He would do whatever it took, no matter how bloody or dangerous it was. "Because—" He started but trailed off, unsure what to tell her. She was in no state to hear about his feelings or anything of that sort. She smiled. "Because you are my fated one?" His eyes widened, but he nodded. She knew. He had suspected as much, but hearing her say it still hit him hard. It unleashed a need to tell her more, to tell her that he had feelings for her and that he wanted to complete this bond between them. He held his tongue instead, because he didn't want to tell her things in the heat of the moment that she might not remember when the madness lost its grip on her. He needed to know that she was in control and knew what she was saying when he told her, and she gave him a response. He didn't think he could handle her admitting her feelings for him, only to forget she had ever said anything about them. "Tell me," he husked, voice thick with emotion and need to know what had happened to her so he could understand her and help her. He didn't want to hurt her, but he had to know. She looked down at her wrists and began rubbing them again. "The first caught me 3 centuries ago. A mortal. He tried to break me, but I was too strong. So he sold me." Her hands trembled and Blue had to pin his feet to the ground to stop himself from crossing the short span of black rock to her. The need to hold her was overwhelming, battering his control. But he had to keep his distance and let her talk. She needed to tell someone what had happened to her. He could see it in her because he had been in the same situation once, only he hadn't shared his feelings, and they had festered inside him, corrupting him. He didn't want that for her. "The second was a shifter, a cat, and the third was a witch." A dark smile curled her lips. "Even they were not strong enough. I fought them, I hurt them, and they sold me." Her shaking worsened. "The fourth," she swallowed hard and closed her eyes. "He was stronger, owned many females. He—" Her eyes snapped open, a glassy quality to them. She wasn't with him again. She was lost in her memories, drowning in them. "I wanted to fly. I want to fly." She looked beyond him. Blue inched into her line of sight. "I know. You can fly soon. But you were telling me something." And it was hurting her. He wanted to tell her she could stop, but she had to keep talking. She needed to speak about what had happened to her, and she hadn't come far enough yet. She hadn't delved deep enough for their conversation to have done her any good. He hated listening to her talking about the things that had happened to her, despised the way her heart would hitch whenever she tried to say that the males had touched her, but couldn't bring herself to speak the words. But he would put himself through this torment if it would help her. "Did they ever?" He couldn't finish that question. Wasn't sure he was strong enough to hear her answer without losing his mind and going mad with a need to slaughter every male who had done so much as look at her. She shook her head. "I fought them. I hurt them." But they had hurt her too. It was there in her eyes. She might have managed to fight the males off to stop them from forcing her into sex, but they had lashed out at her in return, punishing her for disobeying them and not allowing them to paw her and use her against her will. His strong, brave little female. Tears lined her eyes and she wrapped her arms around herself. "The fifth, a fae, an incubus. He kept me in a cage, made me watch things." She shuddered and curled into herself, and he couldn't stop himself from moving closer to her, filled with a need to comfort her. She looked so small like that, vulnerable. Gods, he needed to hold her. Her eyes squeezed shut and she lowered her head. "He liked me watching. He liked it when I tried to make him stop. He hurt females just to see me react. My brother hurts females." Her knees gave out, and he caught her before she hit the rough ground, wrapping his arms around her and pulling her close to him. He realized his mistake, but it was too late. He couldn't undo what had happened. All he could do was brace himself for her wrath. It didn't come. Rather than lashing out at him, she buried her face against his neck, her breath hot on his skin as she sobbed. He straightened with her, closed his eyes, and rubbed her back between her shoulders, muttering soothing things to her in the elf tongue. The need to kill that had been surging like a terrible tide within him washed away, running from him as he held her and listened to her ragged breaths and felt the wet of her tears on his shoulder. I need to fly, she whispered, lips brushing his skin, and he tried not to draw pleasure from that caress. I know, he murmured and stroked her hair, holding her gently and absorbing how good she felt against him, and how good it felt that she let him do this for her, despite everything that had happened to her. She let him hold her even though males had hurt her. Did that mean she trusted him not to do the same? He wasn't brave enough to ask, so he voiced another question instead. What happened with the fifth? Because he wanted to kill that male first. The sixth murdered him. Damn. He would have to settle for the pleasure of killing that male instead. Who was he? He lowered his head and breathed in her scent, using the smell of sunshine and blue skies to calm his furious need to avenge her. A demon, she whispered against his flesh. He grew angry with me when I kept fighting him and managed to destroy half of his home, and took me back to the market to sell me and replace me with someone weaker. She was lucky that dragons were so rare and valuable in the slave trade. Otherwise, any one of the males she had fought and denied might have killed her rather than sold her. The market where I saw you. She nodded and settled her head on his shoulder, and gods, it felt like heaven. The fingers of her left hand traced patterns on his right pectoral, and he could feel her focus was there, on where she touched him. Kate helped me escape. A hellcat. She drew back and looked up at him, her eyes crystal clear and shining. She was back with him, the tides of her memories abating, and deep in the pit of his soul he felt warmed by the knowledge that he had helped her. He would keep helping her. He would do whatever it took, for however long it took, to free her from her past. Her eyes leaped between his. I knew you were coming. Because you saw me in a vision. He frowned down at her and she nodded again. They only come when I am near. Another nod, a little smile. Because you are my fated one. Her fingers paused at their work of driving him mad with a need to caress her in return, to learn her body at the same time as she learned his, taking small steps forwards and closing the gap between them until they finally came together. She pressed her palm against his bare chest, scalding him and branding his flesh with her touch. You are my fated one? Her eyes searched his. He nodded. I am. And you are mine. Mine. God's, she was. His mate. Mine. He wanted to growl that word at her, but bit down on his tongue instead, aware that if he uttered it, he would push her back into the past, to times when other males had sought possession of her, had tried to rule her. He wanted nothing of that sort, and the word would simply be an admission on his part, telling her more that he belonged to her now than she belonged to him, but it would frighten her nonetheless. Gods, he was hers, though. He had been hers from the moment he had set eyes on her. He just hadn't known it back then. He knew it now as he gazed down at her, though, her warm body pressing against his, her beautiful eyes tinged with shyness, as if she was aware of his sentimental thoughts, could hear them rattling around his head, not the thoughts of a warrior, cold and methodical, but the thoughts of a lover, tender and warm. Probably the last thing she expected from him, given their history. Her smile faded and she lowered her gaze to his chest. I have caused you trouble, though. You had to fly, he said in a matter-of-fact tone, one he hoped would make her see that he understood her now, and that what she had done mattered little to him, because she had needed to do it. Her smile returned, and it was hard to hold back and stop himself from caressing her cheek. My prince will understand when we return to the castle and speak with him. Taryn stiffened. I cannot go back. He sighed and rubbed her shoulders, frowned at how cold they were, and teleported the blanket to his hand. He wrapped it around her again, and then encircled her in his arms and drew her against him, using his body to warm hers. The tension melted from her the instant they made contact, and the warmth in the pit of his soul grew hotter, a flicker of flame that she had fanned with her acceptance of his embrace, one that comforted him deeply. She settled her cheek against his chest again. He rested his chin on top of her head and stared across the cave. "They will put me back." "It will not happen again." He cut her off and held her closer, surprised when she pressed against him, as if she needed to be closer still, as if she needed him. "I will make sure of it. I won't let anything happen to you, Taryn. I will protect you." She pulled back again and looked up into his eyes, hers wide and filled with warmth and surprise that he could feel flowing through her blood. He released her and gave up fighting his urges. He brushed the backs of his fingers across her cheek and murmured in a husky, low voice, "I will protect you. From your brother, from the soldiers, from everyone if I must." Heat stirred in his veins as she gazed up at him, and it ran through their connection, too, flowing from her and into him. That connection blossomed, grew stronger as he fell into her eyes, forging an unbreakable link between their hearts. Her hands pressed against his bare chest, burning him with her touch, turning his control to ashes as her lips parted and she leaned closer. His gaze fell to her mouth. He tried to look away, but his eyes refused to leave the tempting curves of her lips as she tilted her head back. An invitation. Gods, he wanted to take it. But she was hurting, had just bared the darkest part of her past and was vulnerable. He couldn't take advantage of her like that, no matter how desperately he wanted to kiss her. He cursed the part of himself that had suddenly turned all noble. Just days ago, he would have had her pinned to the wall and panting his name already, but now he couldn't bring himself to do it. "Blue," she husked, and gods, his name sounded too good when it fell from her lips like that, breathed on a passion-drenched sigh, a sigh that stirred the images of his dreams in his mind, the wicked acts they had performed while tangled together, lost for a moment in each other. Her eyes darkened, pupils gobbling up the white around the inside of her irises, leaving them more purple. She pushed her hands up his chest and looped her arms around his neck, and his breathing deepened as she pulled him down to her, closing the gap between their mouths. He clutched her hips and felt her trembling beneath his hands. Or was that him? It was difficult to tell. Every inch of him felt as if it was shaking. He tensed and she stopped with their lips a bare inch apart. "Tell me you know what you are doing, and that you want this. That this means something, and you aren't just scratching an itch or trying to make yourself forget things for a while." He eased back and looked down into her eyes. "Tell me you are here with me, Taryn." She shifted her hands, caressing them up his neck to cup his cheeks, and held his gaze as she tilted his head down towards her, her gaze earnest and beautiful, and her feelings steady. "I am here with you, Blue. I want this." She tiptoed, pressed her lips to his, and whispered, "I want you." Chapter 25. Blue seized her lips in a hard kiss, unable to hold back as her sweet taste flooded him and she pressed against him, her words ringing in his mind, stripping away his strength to resist. She wanted him. Fuck, he wanted her too. He had wanted her for so long now, had ached for her without ever knowing it, and now she would be his. Every single damn dream he'd had of her was about to become reality. His cock pressed uncomfortably against the lacing of his trousers, instantly hard, painfully so. Taryn only made things worse when she loosed a little moan, the wicked sound teasing his ears and sending him spiraling out of control. His hunger for her took the reins and drove all sense into submission, until there was only a need to touch and taste her, to tease her to climax and hear her cry his name. His mate. He would satisfy her. Her need ran through him, powerful and intense, a force that mastered him until all he could think about was pleasing her and satiating her need. She needed. Fuck, she needed and he did too. He needed to give her everything she ached for, satisfying her until she had no energy left, was limp and spent in his arms. He growled into her mouth and she stiffened, her hands tensed against his cheeks. Blue silently cursed himself and drew back, breaking the kiss. Even that was painful for him, took every drop of his will when all he wanted to do was keep kissing her. He pressed his forehead to hers and breathed hard, struggling to steady himself and claw back some control. Her words rang around his head, ones about her past now, and he found the balance he had been seeking. He couldn't frighten her. He had to be gentle with her, even when that felt impossible. "Sorry," he uttered, and she shook her head. "Do not be," she whispered, sweet breath washing across his damp lips, teasing them until they tingled with a need to kiss her again. "It startled me. But dear gods, I want to growl too when you kiss me. It's as if my whole body has come alive, and I am overloading with sensation." He chuckled, wrapped his arms around her, and pulled her closer, as close as he could get her. A smile tugged at his lips, one he felt right down in his soul. "You have a way with words that is only going to push me back over the edge, little dragon." She nudged her nose against his. "Little dragon? You are the little dragon, with your horns." She pulled back, and he didn't like the frown she wore as she looked up at him. "I am sorry your armor is lost." He wasn't. Going to find it back in her brother's stronghold would have placed them both in danger, because she would have had to help him, her knowledge of the castle key in locating it. "Armor is replaceable." He swept the backs of his fingers across her cheek, and his eyes darted between hers as she gazed up at him. "You are not." A blush blazed up her cheeks, heating his fingers, and she looked away from him, but not before he caught the flicker of shyness in her eyes mingling with the desire he could feel in her. Her palms drifted down to his shoulders and then his chest, and he couldn't keep his eyes open. They slipped shut as the heat of her caress traveled through him, his skin tingling wherever she roamed, anticipation coiling in his gut as he rushed to imagine where she might go next. She skimmed her hands over his pectorals and downwards, her fingertips catching on his pebbled nipples, sending sparks skittering across his flesh. "Growl," she whispered in a low, teasing voice that only heightened everything he was feeling, stirring his desire to painful levels. "I can feel you want to. I like it when you growl, Blue." "Why?" Fuck, was that his voice? Strained and low, pulled tight by little more than a light caress? He shivered from head to toe when she traced the ridges of his abdomen with her fingers, and he felt the searing heat of her gaze on his body. Did she like what she saw? Her thoughts back in the dungeon of her brother's castle flooded his mind, answering that question for him. She had liked seeing his body and hearing him growl. It had turned her on. "Because I like how little control you have when you are around me," she murmured and dropped her head, pressed wet kisses along his collarbone. He couldn't contain the growl that rumbled through his chest as she tortured him. She flicked her tongue across the line of scars on the left side of his throat. "I like the way it tells me how much you want me." He grabbed her hips and dropped his mouth to her neck and growled against it as he kissed her, alternating between nipping her flesh and sucking on it. His mouth watered, fangs punching long from his gums. He screwed his eyes closed further as he savored her, teetering on the brink of taking things a step further and nicking her skin so he could steal a drop of her blood. He pushed that thought out of his head and reined himself back in. It was more difficult this time, and Taryn didn't help when she moaned and angled her head away from him, giving him better access to her throat. She pressed blunt teeth into his shoulder, her breath hot and moist against his skin. Blue clutched her closer and licked her throat, felt the ragged marks under his tongue. It was enough to ground him and purge the need to bite her. He drew back and gazed down at the marks. Savage, vicious. He had treated his mate poorly. She had tried to help him, and he had repaid her by attempting to kill her. He tensed when Taryn's left hand caught his cheek, and she drew him around to face her, dragging his eyes away from her neck. For a moment he thought she would say something as she had before, offering him forgiveness when he deserved none. But then she did something that unraveled him and tore down what little strength he had left, completely shattering the barriers around his heart. She kissed him, softly, tenderly. There was forgiveness and understanding in the soft brush of her mouth across his, in the tender way she stroked his cheeks with her thumbs and held him. Heat and light flowed through him, and all he could do was press his fingers into her hips and hold on to her. He would never let her go. Blue wrapped his arms around her and kissed her back, sweeping his tongue across the seam of her mouth. Her lips parted and he delved his tongue inside, loved it when she moaned and pressed closer, her tongue coming to tentatively stroke his. She gained confidence as he kissed her, dueling with him for dominance. Gods, she had to know how that stoked him, made him burn hotter for her. She had to feel how close he was to losing control when he was trying to retain it so he didn't frighten her. His little dragon lost control first. She wrapped her arms around his neck, dragged him down to her and kissed him harder, loosing a growl into his mouth. The sound of it echoed around the cave, feral and wild, speaking to him of her need as it ran through his blood. He growled right back at her, earning a moan as his reward, and then growled deeper and longer when she shirked the blanket. Her bare skin was warm and soft beneath his fingers as he ran his hands down her back, curled them over her bottom. It gave beneath his grip, and he pressed his fingers in, clutching her against him. The feel of her breasts against his chest, their bare skin rubbing as she tiptoed to kiss him deeper, was too much. He groaned and gritted his teeth, breathed hard as a hunger to turn with her and pin her to the wall surged through him. He had to be gentle. His little dragon was doing everything to drive that word out of his vocabulary. He tensed when she dipped her head and kissed down the line of his throat, nipped at his collarbone, and then continued a path across his chest. Her tongue flicked his right nipple, and he growled, tipped his head back, and prayed for strength. Gentle. He had to be gentle with her. Fuck. He was going to lose his mind fighting this internal war. Every part of him, from his mind to his soul to his body, screamed at him to surrender to the hunger he had been holding back. It roared at him to give in to it. He needed Taryn. She was the air in his lungs and the life in his veins. His very existence depended on her. It felt as if it depended on this moment, as if he would die if he didn't surrender to his need. She caressed his chest, and then her hands drifted lower, over his sides before sweeping back in to brush his stomach. He shuddered and moaned with each torturous touch. His fangs lengthened and cock pulsed, both itching with a hunger to sink into her. He tensed and growled when she thumbed his nipples, lips peeling back off his fangs. His ears flared, growing pointier as desire took hold of him, hijacking control again. Every sweep of her fingers or her lips was excruciatingly wonderful, so intensely pleasurable that it wound him tighter, cranked him higher. He tried to keep still and let her explore him at her leisure, felt the need that ran through their link, but it was impossible. She was making it impossible. Her hands caressed his shoulders, fingers pressing in when she reached his deltoids, a brief flash of her strength that aroused him to the point of pain. The thought of touching her in return tore at the tiny sliver of control he was clinging to, tugging it through his grasp. But it was the way she feathered her fingers up his throat and then over his earlobes and up to the point of his ears that ripped it from him. He shuddered, couldn't stop his hips from rocking, rubbing his cock against his trousers as pleasure so intense that it damn near blinded him bolted through him. He breathed hard, fought for control over his body, but she curled her fingers around to behind his ears and rubbed her thumbs up to the tips, and his length pulsed so hard he almost came. He growled, swept her up into his arms, and kissed her fiercely, swallowing her gasp as his lips clashed with hers, teeth knocking together. She tensed, but he didn't let up, couldn't. He plundered her mouth with his tongue, gathered her closer, and bent her to his will. She moaned, the sweet sound driving him on, telling him that she enjoyed this wild side of him, this side that showed her just how much he wanted her, needed her. Fuck. He would die without her. He turned and pinned her back to the wall, pressed his body to hers and caged her there. She tensed again, but quickly relaxed this time, her short nails pressing into his shoulders as she kissed him back, mouth seeking to master his. Not a damn chance. She had pushed too far, shoved him over the edge, and there was no coming back for him. Whatever control he'd had, she had shattered it, and he couldn't piece it back together. He needed her, couldn't breathe or think or do anything but feel. Blue caught her under her thighs and lifted her legs, made her wrap them around his waist, and then cupped her backside. Fuck. He couldn't breathe. The feel of her heat so close to his fingertips would have been devastating enough, but she was wet with the need he could feel flowing through her. He growled as he shifted his fingers closer to her groin, and she moaned and wriggled, the hunger that constantly ebbed and flowed through their connection turning into desperate need that he couldn't ignore. She needed him. He pressed closer, moaned low in his throat when his rigid length met her body, and she actually rocked against it. Holy fuck. He kissed her harder, broke away from her mouth, and devoured the unmarked side of her throat. Couldn't stop himself as she rubbed her body against his. He took it back. She could master him still. She stripped him of his control with little more than a flex of her body against his, and he was a slave to her again, lost in sensation and his spiraling need. Fuck, she could do whatever she wanted with him, as long as it felt that good. He pressed his lips to her shoulder and gave himself over to it, all thought of moving fleeing as she rolled her hips, rubbing herself along him. It was her dissatisfied mule that made him move again, pulled him back to the moment and stirred his instincts as her fated male. Her mate. He obeyed her when she shoved at his hips, moving back a few inches but keeping a firm grip on her bottom so she didn't fall. She leaned back and he groaned as she fumbled with the lacing on his trousers, her eyes dark with hunger that called to him. "Blue," she uttered when the lacing nodded and threw him a desperate look that had him moving in an instant to help her. He set her down on her feet and teleported his trousers away. Her eyes darkened further, pupils devouring her irises as she raked her gaze over the taut ridges of his stomach, past his navel to the blunt tip of his cock. Her lips parted, and gods, the things he wanted to do with that mouth. The thought he had picked up back in the cell when he had been healing her wound flooded him again, aroused him back to the point of pain, and his cock kicked against his stomach, jerking with approval as his mind raced forwards to fulfilling that desire she'd had. That need to know how good his tongue would feel on her flesh. She reached a trembling hand towards his shaft and frowned when he dropped to his knees. The rough black ground bit into them, but he didn't feel the stab of the pebbles as he gazed at her hips, at the sweet, neat thatch of violet curls at the apex of her thighs. "Blue," she whispered, uncertainty lacing her voice, stirring his softer side and the part of him that wanted to be gentle with her. He looked back up at her. Fuck, she really was beautiful. She towered over him, gazing down at him, the shyness back in her eyes as her eyebrows furrowed, and she worried her lower lip with her teeth. How could such a powerful female look so innocent? She had been more than wicked in the dreams they had shared, skilled with her mouth and her body, but here in reality she looked ready to bolt. He lowered his eyes to her hips again and called himself a bastard, because he couldn't let her back down now. He needed to taste her. She trembled under his fingers as he ran them up her calves, over her knees, and swept them up to her hips. Her throat worked on a hard swallow. He kept his eyes locked with hers and skimmed his palms over her hips and down her inner thighs, brushing the edges of her groin. Her eyes slipped shut and her breath left her in a rush, and the hunger that swept through their incomplete bond damn near had him coming. Gods, the power she had over him. If only she knew. He dropped his hungry gaze to her hips, and she didn't resist when he carefully applied a little pressure to the back of her left thigh. She let him move her leg, only moaned when he hooked it over his shoulder, exposing her core to the cool air of the cave. Her breath hitched when he leaned in, hands coming down on his head and his shoulder, and a flicker of uncertainty ran through her again. He blew across her tiny bead and she shuddered and moaned, clutched him tightly with both hands. He swept his up her inner thighs and gently parted her plush lips, revealing her to his greedy eyes. Gods, he wanted to devour her. He would devour her. Blue stroked his tongue across her pert nub, and she jerked against his face, a bark of pleasure exploding from her lips. He groaned and did it again, drinking down each gasp and moan that left her as she grew accustomed to his caress. When she relaxed against the wall, her grip on him going lax, he delved lower, lapped at her entrance and moaned at the taste of her. Sweet and sublime. He could feast on her forever and never get enough. He licked back up, flicking his tongue over her nub, took pleasure from her high gasp as she quaked against him. He wanted more. He wanted all of her. Taryn shuddered again, her hands gripping more tightly when he rubbed his thumbs downward, teasing her slick core with one while he tortured her with his tongue. She moaned and writhed, the hunger that constantly flowed from her into him growing fiercer, mingling with desperation. She wanted release, needed it. He would give it to her. He circled her entrance with his finger and slipped it inside, just enough to press against the fleshy part of her that would have her screaming out her climax before long. His tongue flickered over her nub, swirled and pressed as he stroked her with his finger. Her breaths turned ragged and she dug her fingers into his shoulder and tangled her other hand in his hair, twining the lengths between her fingers and pulling on it as she desperately rolled her hips. Blue angled his head and suckled her arousal as he added another finger, stretched her and stroked her harder. Moisture ran down his fingers and pooled in his palm, hot against his skin. He groaned and nipped at her bead with his blunt teeth, his cock kicking against his stomach, balls tightening at the thought of being inside her and feeling her juices coating him as they coated his hand. She moaned and wriggled, breathed sigh after sigh as she sought release. He couldn't stop his imagination from racing ahead, picturing feeding his cock into her core and seeing her face as he seated himself inside her, stretching her and claiming her. He groaned and licked harder, pressed deeper with his fingers, and she cried out, her entire body jerking towards him and tensing as she quivered around him. Hot liquid streamed down his fingers and he lapped at her nub, listening to her ragged breathing and feeling her heart racing in his chest as her climax swept through her. When she sank against the wall and pushed against his shoulder and head, a giggle escaping her, he drew back, obeying her silent command to give her a moment. A smile played on her lips as she looked down at him, panting, her eyes twinkling but still dark with desire. A real smile. One that hit him so hard in the chest it knocked the wind from him. He stared up at her and that smile faded, as if his serious expression was contagious. She blinked slowly and 1,000 things rushed to the tip of his tongue, half of them ridiculous nonsense about how beautiful she was, and the other half liable to frighten her away. He didn't want to drive her away. He needed her too much. Her eyes slowly drifted over him and settled on his cock. It kicked in response to the heat of her gaze on it and the way her eyes darkened, hunger reigniting in them. Blue withdrew his hand from her, and she looked at it as he brought it towards him and then up into his eyes. He held her gaze as he licked her spending from his fingers, relishing every drop as if it was ambrosia. Fuck, it was ambrosia. The greatest drug he had ever known. It sent fire blazing through his blood, stirred his desire to beyond the point of pain, made him desperate for her in a way he had never experienced before. Taryn looked him over again and then stepped towards him. His breath hitched, and he had the feeling that she was about to turn the tables on him, and this time he would be the one screaming his lungs out. Fuck, he wanted that. She lifted her leg, flashing heaven at him, and his breath left him in a rush as she pressed her foot to his shoulder and pushed him onto his back. He lay half on the black ground and half on the blanket, unable to move as he stared up at her, anticipation coiling in his stomach again, making his hard length jerk near constantly against his stomach. Her eyes raked over him again, hungry gaze burning him and stoking the fire, until it was an inferno and he couldn't breathe as he watched her coming to stand over his hips, followed her as she lowered herself and sat astride him. He hissed as her wet heat encased his cock and tipped his head back into the floor, body straining as bliss rolled through him. That sense of heaven only grew as she rose off him again, her eyes on his the whole time, and grasped hold of his cock. She positioned it beneath her and he stilled, dropped his gaze to where she held him, and bit his lower lip as she eased back. The head of his cock pushed against her moist core, and he groaned through gritted teeth as her heat scalded him, hotter and wetter than he had imagined. He held back, resisting the need to thrust himself to the hilt inside of her, allowing her to be in control even when he wanted to flip her over and take her hard and fast. He lifted his hips a little, though, impatience tearing at his control, and groaned at how tight she was around him, gloving him and gripping him fiercely. He pushed upwards as she moved downwards, a bit rougher than he had meant to be. She flinched. At least he thought it was because he had been rough, until his lust-fogged mind cleared enough to realize it had been for a different reason. She was tight, and it had nothing to do with his size. He grasped her hips, tried to stop her, but she growled at him, flashing killer-sharp teeth. She grabbed his hands, shoved them up to his shoulders, and pinned them on the ground there as she inched back onto him. Violet fire flashed in her eyes, and the hunger she felt surged through him, more powerful than he had ever felt it, a possessive force that knocked the wind from him. Not born of violence, but born of desire. Her face screwed up as she sank back onto him, her breath coming in fast pants as she held him pinned beneath her, an echo of her pain trickling through him. It burned brighter, but she didn't stop. She pressed down on him, pushed past the point of pain, and all her strength and fight seemed to leave her as the tip of his cock hit the furthest point it could reach. She sank against his chest, breathing hard, heart racing. Her hands went lax against his, and he kept still beneath her, still struggling to take in what had just happened. She was untouched. His addled mind bandied that around, and the more he thought about it, the stronger his feelings grew, until he felt dangerously possessive of her. Because he was her first, her only. She was purely his. No other male had touched her. No other male had marked her. She was his alone, his forever. The urge to bite her again was overwhelming, but he clamped his jaws shut and focused on her instead, on the feel of her wrapped around his hard cock and the way she was resting on him, her cheek pressing against his chest and hands linked with his. "Why didn't you tell me?" he whispered, voice hoarse and thick, rumbling around the dark cave. The thought that she was his alone soon gave way to another one, a realization that hit him hard. His little dragon must have fought her owners fiercely in order to remain untouched. When she had been telling him about her past, he hadn't once believed she had managed to stop them from touching her. In the years he had known of her existence, he hadn't once thought she would be intact. He had presumed she would have known males in her past, that she would have taken lovers. He knew of dragons. He knew their females were renowned for their passion and carnal hungers, and that they took lovers whenever their needs arose, using them to sate their desire. That part of Taryn had been at the helm when she had pinned him to the floor. "Because I knew you would try to stop me," she said, and rose off him, and he groaned as he slid deeper into her heat. Her eyes darkened again, and her hunger mingled with his. "And I did not want to stop." She wriggled her hips, and he moaned again, every inch of him tensing as pleasure blasted through him. "I told you that I wanted you." She had, but he hadn't realized the meaning behind those words, that she wanted him when she had never wanted another. She had kept herself pure. Now all he could think about was how he was tainting her. He had known 7 centuries ago that she was his fated female, and although he had conditioned himself to forget about her, deep down he had been aware of what she was to him. His instincts as her mate wouldn't have allowed his most primal side to forget her. That knowledge hadn't stopped him from scratching his biological itches with other females, though. There had been no feelings behind his trysts. Those moments he had shared with them had been purely a satisfaction of needs. But that didn't stop him from feeling sick to the pit of his stomach as he gazed up at her. The feeling that he didn't deserve her grew stronger alongside his feelings for her, sinking its claws in deep, shredding his soul and threatening to tear him apart. Lauren had been celibate for millennia waiting for his Kiara, and he hadn't even known who she was and when he would meet her, if he would ever meet her. Blue had known of his, but he had still slept with many females. He had told his sister countless times how much he longed for his fated one, and when she had come along, he had turned his back on her and conditioned himself to forget her because he had believed she could never be his. But now he had hope. He was here with her, and being with her made him see just how hollow the moments he had shared with those females in his past had been, because Taryn filled him up and made him feel whole, complete. Yet he couldn't stop feeling as if he was tainting her. The gods only knew how long she had been alive. He found it hard to comprehend that she had been around for the 700 years he had known her without ever seeking a male's touch. The thought that she had been celibate for longer than that blew his mind, stirred his possessiveness. Fuck. He had to go back to the castle with her at some point. And what sort of male was he going to be then, when his little dragon was around so many unmated males? "Your eyes have gone dark," she whispered, a trace of fear in her voice, and he closed them. Her palms pressed against his cheeks. "You are mad at me?" "Gods, no," he barked and looked at her, wanting her to see in his eyes that he wasn't. He could never be angry with her. He was angry with himself. He was angry with males he didn't even know, furious at the thought they might look at her. "I just can't stop thinking." "So stop thinking," she whispered in a sultry voice, and leaned over him, brushed her lips across his chest, and licked the scars on his throat. He wasn't sure he could. She proved him wrong when she moved, shifting on his cock, rising slowly off it before pressing back down. Fuck. Not a single thought remained in his mind as she began riding him. Slowly at first, tentative thrusts that had him staring at her through wide eyes as he grew accustomed to how tight she was, how hot. Her pace gained confidence and speed, and he could only growl and tip his head back as he fought for control, tried to let her be the one to master him and take the lead. Hunger pooled in his chest, a dark need to roll her over and take her, to possess her and make her see that her weight had been worth it. He would make a good mate for her. She moaned, threw her head back, and moved faster, her pert breasts bouncing with each upwards stroke and downwards plunge. Her palms pressed against his chest, fingertips digging into his pectorals. He gritted his teeth, breathed harder as he had to focus to master his own damned body as she clenched him, flexing her wet heat around him. Her slick juices rolled down his shaft, trickled through his curls, dampened his balls. Holy fuck. He couldn't do this. He growled and her eyes flicked open, locking on him, dark and filled with desire. With a challenge. One he was quick to take, surrendering to the wild part of himself that roared at him to bend her to his will and bring her to a shattering climax. He rolled with her, pinned her on the blanket without missing a stroke, and she cried out as he drove into her, deeper than when she had been riding him. Her hands flew to his shoulders and her nails dug into his flesh, tiny points of pain that backed up the flood of feelings rushing through their link. She liked this. She clung to him as he plunged into her, breathless moans escaping her lips each time the tip of his cock struck deep, and he withdrew, pumping her deeply to make sure she felt every inch of him, to make sure she knew just how hard she made him, how wild. Her arms wrapped around him and she craned her neck, capturing his lips with hers as he rocked into her. She pressed the heels of her feet into the earth and pushed her hips up, and he groaned and shuddered as he slid deeper, moaning in time with her. She devoured his mouth as he pumped her and fought for control, to retain a sliver of it when all he wanted to do was let go, and allow the untamed part of him that she had unleashed to take the lead. Taryn didn't seem to have any problem with allowing that. She clawed at his shoulders and hooked one leg around his waist and rocked against him, countering his thrusts, a wild little thing in his arms. She growled into his mouth and kissed him harder, driving him into surrendering to his need. His control shattered, and he couldn't hold himself back. Blue drove into her, rolling his hips with each deep thrust of his cock, every plunge that struck her hard and had her quivering against him, whispering wicked things against his lips in the dragon tongue. She wanted more. Fuck. He snarled, grabbed her under her left thigh to hold her backside off the blanket, and curled his other hand around the nape of her neck, clutching it tightly to hold her in place. He thrust harder, deeper, devouring her mouth as he took her and claimed her, stamping his mark on her and ensuring she would want no other male. She moaned into his mouth and ran sharp nails over his back, scoring his flesh and filling the cave with the scent of blood. His mouth watered, fangs dropping as he thought about biting her. Her tongue brushed the tip of his left fang. A little gasp escaped her, and then the taste of her flooded his mouth. Gods help her. Gods help him. He snarled and kissed her harder, desperate to taste her again as he took her, drove as deep as she could take him, all thought of being gentle gone. He couldn't stop himself or hold back, and the fear he had of hurting her crushed his soul. Until she moaned and clawed harder, tugged him closer and kissed him back, as lost to desire as he was. He clutched her hip and thrust harder, driving every inch of his hard cock into her as his balls drew up, semen rising to the base of his length. He groaned as she stroked his fang again, rubbing her tongue along it, sending sparks skittering down his spine to his balls, twisting them tighter still. Her hand shifted from his shoulders, and she caught the sides of his head, and he couldn't breathe as her palms brushed his ears, teasing their sensitive tips. The whole universe detonated. His body shattered into a million pieces, leaving only an explosion of feeling that rocked him to his soul and had him shaking from head to toe. Taryn moaned hotly into his mouth, quivering beneath him, her ecstasy rolling through him and heightening his own, until they mingled so completely that he was no longer sure who he was and whose feelings they were. There was only one heart beating rapidly, one soul on fire, a perfect union that he would make sure lasted forever. Now that he had Taryn, the other half of his soul, his heart, he was never letting her go. She was his forever. He managed to pull back and look down at her. She smiled, rosy, kiss-swollen lips curling in a way that warmed his heart, chased the darkness from his soul, and made him feel as if he had come home. He growled a single word in his mind, one that he felt to the very pit of the soul she had completed. Mine. Chapter 26. Taryn listened to the heart drumming against her right ear, the sedated rhythm perfectly matching the pace of hers. His steady breathing filled the quiet, dimly lit cave, a sound that she found strangely soothing together with the warmth of him against her and the feel of his arms wrapped around her, keeping her pinned to the side of his body beneath the black blanket. Blue. From time to time in the 7th century she had known him, she had wondered about his name, but she had never caught it. She had never imagined it to be the one he had given to her, though. But now she knew it, she felt it suited him somehow. He warmed her and made her feel free as if she was flying in the blue skies that he no doubt knew. She lifted her head from his bare chest, wanting to ask him about the mortal world. But the questions fled her lips when she saw his face peaceful in slumber, relaxed and more handsome than ever. He needed to rest. She had sensed it in their connection, the one he had forged by drinking from her, triggering the bonding process in an elven way. She could still sense it in him now, while he was sleeping. She needed to rest, too, if she was going to be strong enough to face what lay ahead of her. But she couldn't bring herself to close her eyes. It felt as if by doing so she would be squandering this moment of calm with him, this brief time when everything outside the cave didn't exist, and there was only the two of them without a care in the world. She couldn't remember ever feeling like this before. She hadn't thought it possible. When lost to her memories, she had told him things she had sworn she would never reveal to anyone, fear of how they would view her forcing her to hold her tongue. In that spell of madness, awareness of what she had been doing had been stripped from her, and she had let it all spill from her lips. She had told him everything. But rather than turning away from her as she had expected, fulfilling her fear that no one would love her if they knew about her past and the things she had done, the terrible centuries she had somehow survived, he had done the opposite. He had drawn her to him. Instead of rejecting her, he had forged a stronger connection between them, bringing them closer together. She still marveled at that, feeling as if she had dreamed it all. It was going to take time for it to sink in, but even in his sleep, he was taking steps to make that happen without even knowing it. She gazed down at him, the way he held her close to him, telling her something that slowly washed away some of the hurt in her past, because his embrace was tender, filled with affection that she knew he didn't want to admit to her. She could understand his reservations, because she had them too, was struggling with these new feelings growing inside her just as he was. He mumbled something in his strange tongue, lyrical words that sounded as magical as many in hell thought his kind to be. His lips smacked together, his nose twitched, and then he sighed as he relaxed again beneath her. She lost track of time as she studied him, absorbing everything about him as he slept, unaware of her watching over him. Such a strong male, fierce, dangerous, possessive. She had felt that last one in him when they had made love. It had run through her, too, awakening her dragon instincts as his female, and forcing her to respond to her desire by staking a claim on him, and making it clear she wouldn't accept no as an answer. She had never surrendered to that instinct before, but she had let it overcome her in the moment, had embraced it, and had seen the flicker of excitement that had brightened his eyes. He had liked her taking charge, exerting her strength, and showing him how fiercely she wanted him. Just thinking about it fanned the embers of desire in her veins, until she burned for him again. Taryn tamped them down, aware that she would wake him if she continued to let her desires run rampant and unchecked. They were bonded now, not in a permanent way, but in one strong enough that he could sense things in her. She could sense things in him, too, but some of those things she didn't need a bond to make her see them. He felt guilty. She had caught the way his expression shifted whenever he glanced at her throat, the flashes of guilt that crossed his eyes before he dragged them away, and the shame and self-reproach that simmered in his veins. She dimly remembered mentioning it to him when she had been lost in her memories, and how wounded he had looked. She remembered it because she had felt bad, guilty about the barb she had thrown at him when he had helped her, had burst into the elven cell block bare seconds after they had put her in a cage and had freed her from captivity. Normally, when the memories seized her as strongly as they had back then, she couldn't remember anything that she did, relived her past so vividly that she wasn't aware of anything else. Was it his presence that had helped her retain enough of her consciousness to combat the memories and remain partially aware of the world and the things that were happening around her? His presence seemed to trigger a lot of things in her, not only a strength to battle her memories or to see a vision of the future. It triggered a heat in her, too, a hunger that was startling in its intensity and felt as if it was impossible to sate. Even just the feel of his bare skin against hers was enough to have her tingling wherever he touched. The dark slashes of his eyebrows twitched into a frown. "I can feel you staring," he rumbled, voice a low drone that soothed her but stirred the heat growing inside her, fanning it hotter. He lifted his right hand away from her bare back, ran his fingers through his tousled blue-black hair and yawned. No fangs, but his canines were still longer than a mortal's would be, a sign that part of him was still on edge. Or hungry. He tucked his right arm behind his head, stifled another yawn, and slowly opened his eyes. Pure amethyst. Sometimes she wished her eyes were like his, not strangely two-tone. None would stare at her or think her valuable if she had eyes like that. "Come back to me, Taryn," he murmured, and she frowned at him, was on the verge of saying that she hadn't gone anywhere, when it struck her that she had. She had been sinking into her memories again, thinking of all the horrible things that might not have happened to her if she had been like other dragons, a single and common color. Blue raised his left hand and sifted his fingers through her hair, combing it back from her face, and cupped her cheek. Her breath hitched as his heat seeped into her, the softness of his caress warming her right down to her soul, and her heart picked up pace in response to the shiver that ran down her spine. She stared into his eyes, losing herself in them, and not wanting to come back to the world, not when it felt so perfect here with him. She felt so safe, cocooned in the arms of this male she was falling in love with. Had perhaps loved for longer than she cared to admit. He loosed a little moan of pleasure as he stretched beneath her, his delicious body flexing and each muscle announcing itself in a way that had her hungry for another taste of him. She squeezed her thighs together and bit back a moan of her own as she throbbed, still pleasantly sore from their lovemaking. Blue shifted position, moving his right arm higher, so it supported his head. His biceps bulged, and she cursed them for being such a wonderful distraction, together with the rest of him. The gods had been cruel when they had built her mate so perfect. She was surprised she had managed to resist him for this long, had been able to tear herself away from him whenever their paths had crossed. The last time at the slavers' market had been the hardest. She had been so afraid in that moment, tired and battered, on the verge of collapse, and he had been such a temptation. She had wanted to surrender to him, even though she had known that he wouldn't be gentle with her as she had needed, that if she gave up the fight and let him capture her, that only death would have awaited her. Blue sighed and brushed his fingers through her hair. "I am losing you again." Taryn blinked herself back to him. "My mind wandered." "And where did it go?" A half-smile played on his lips, and she cursed the gods again, because now he looked even more perfect, roguish, gorgeous, a little bit wicked. She pulled her gaze away from him, lifting it up to look over his head towards the mouth of the cave. It was growing lighter, bright enough that she could make out the distant peaks across the valley. He would want to go soon. That made her want to tense and hide, and she had to push herself to remain calm and trust him. She did trust him. He had rescued her from the elves who had put her in the cell, and he wanted to help her stop her brother. He had promised she would be safe if she returned to the castle with him and met with his prince, and she believed him. She also believed that he trusted her. It was there for her to see in what he had said to her. His prince would understand when they returned to the castle and spoke with him. He trusted her to meet with the male who ruled the elves, a male she felt Blue was close to, and was more than a master to him. "And there you go again." Blue's deep rumbling voice pulled her back to him. She smiled her apology. "There is much on my mind." He wriggled beneath her, his naked body rubbing hers in a way that threatened to have her getting lost in her thoughts again. More wicked ones this time. "So tell me what you are thinking about," he husked, and she looked back at him, mildly surprised when he looked deadly serious. She couldn't remember the last time she had told someone what was on her mind, but she was sure she had only ever shared her private thoughts with Loki. Maybe her brother had been given that privilege too once, before he had grown into a male more interested in fighting in the arena than spending time with her. "I am not sure where to start," she admitted, and his smile almost blew her away. She really couldn't recall ever seeing him smile, and the lack of laughter lines bracketing his mouth said it happened very rarely indeed. But she kept making him smile. Her belly fluttered and heated. Blue's handsome face turned serious again. "Have I done something wrong?" She quickly shook her head. He frowned. "You keep looking at me strangely, as if there is something wrong with me." Gods. She wanted to tell him that there was absolutely nothing wrong with him, since the gods had made him perfect. She smiled instead. "It is taking me a little time to grow accustomed to you smiling at me." He chuckled. "Fuck, you sound like my sister." It was her turn to frown. "You have a sister? And what is this fuck? You say it often." "I do, a younger one, and it is a modal expression. An exclamation of sorts to declare disbelief or shock, but taken from the profanity they use for what we, did." He waggled an eyebrow. Her cheeks burned up. Well, fuck, he certainly knew how to embarrass her. Blue tugged her closer, that wicked smile teasing his tempting mouth again. "Tell me about you." His violet eyes leaped between hers, intent and focused, his curiosity flowing through her in a way that made it difficult to deny him. "Where do I start?" She leaned over him, resting with her left side on his chest, her breast pressed against his left pectoral. He groaned when she ran her fingers in little circles around his right one, enjoying the feel of his compact muscles beneath her caress, power and strength that she found alluring. The wounds her brother had placed on him were little more than faint marks now, crisscrossing his smooth skin, and she followed the line of one down towards his pebbled nipple. "You can start by stopping doing that. I cannot think when you do that." He scowled at her hand and she obeyed, bringing her palm down to rest on his chest. His frown melted away and his eyes met hers again. "Tell me what happened 7 centuries ago. I need to know if we are going to clear your name with my prince." There he went again, talking about them going together, as if he couldn't bear to part from her. She reminded herself that he had sworn to protect her, and that might be the only reason he wanted to bring her with him when he met with his prince. It might have nothing to do with any sort of feelings he harbored for her, feelings that were impossible to detect even with the incomplete bond linking them. He stirred too many emotions in her that his mingled with, blending together, that she couldn't easily pick them apart to discern which belonged to who. She wasn't about to lay her heart on the line after one night of passion by asking him about his feelings, though. She had lived long enough to know that wasn't a wise move. 7 centuries ago, she started and frowned at his chest, trying to get the story into order to make sure she didn't miss anything vital. She wanted to clear her name too, but not with his prince or the elf kingdom. She only wanted to clear it with him. "I need to go a little further back than that, to where it all began. My brother, we did everything together growing up. But he grew increasingly obsessed with gaining power. It was a poison, one that corrupted his mind and his heart." "It will corrupt the best of people," Blue said, his voice a soothing drone in her ear, and brushed her hair behind her right ear. She nodded. "Tenak began to spend his days planning, searching for a way to achieve the ultimate power and rule hell. I sometimes think his battles in the arena knocked something loose in his mind. He grew convinced that all would bow before him, and that it would be wonderful, and that I would stand at his side and we would have everything we had ever wanted." She closed her eyes and sighed as sorrow swept through her. A familiar cold and numbing feeling that had been a constant companion when she had been around her brother in the decades leading up to his attack on the Elf Kingdom, and in the centuries that had followed it. "I only ever wanted Tenak to be at my side and be happy." She opened her eyes and raised them to meet Blue's beautiful violet ones. The concern and compassion in them warmed her heart and chased away the cold. "I knew that the dark path he had found himself on would tear him away from me and drive him mad." Blue looked as if he wanted to say something, but she shook her head, not wanting him to speak yet. She had started to talk, to tell him her story, and she had to get it all off her chest because it felt like a weight on her heart, one that was lifting with every word that left her lips. "Tenak found old writings about an elven sword and grew determined to steal it. It was a treasure, one he could not live without. He had to possess it. It is the bane of our species," she said, and his lips twitched at the corners, the sparkle of mischief in his eyes warning her that he wanted to tease her about it. It was strange being with him like this when she had been running from him for so long. If she had let him catch her, had told him the truth back then, could she have had this bliss for the past 7 centuries? She sighed and idly traced patterns on his chest again, not wanting to think about what might have been when her future was hardly secure. Tenak was coming for her, and she would arm her mate with all the information she could in order to help him succeed and survive. "The sword was the key to gaining the ultimate treasure in his eyes, the position of ruler of hell. He told me often when I asked him to give up his quest because it was destroying him, that the sword was everything. It was power. It would be his." She cast her gaze down at her fingers and heaved another sigh as she recalled how Tenak had looked at her back then, his eyes bright and shining with something that she now knew was madness. He had lost his mind before she had noticed it, too slow to see it to stop its spread. Each hour we were together, he constantly talked of how the sword would bring all of the realms to their knees before him. It frightened me, but I was too afraid of him to say anything, so I sought the help of a witch. A witch? Blue frowned at her. I had not realized you had assistants. All this time I scoured the lands for you, seemingly asked everyone in the realm about you, and not once have I heard you had the help of a witch. She shrugged. He was very isolated from everything. He? Blue's handsome face darkened in a way she found she liked, a shadow of envy flitting across it and through his blood, too. She smiled at his behavior and walked her fingers across his bare chest. He. Blue snarled, flashing sharp fangs. I will kill him if he touched you. That pleased her even more, but she concealed it from him, not wanting to encourage his violent behavior. He did not touch me. He wanted a stone in exchange, something about an experiment. She shook her head again, dislodging her lingering curiosity about the witch and his reasons for desiring such a rare gem. I had one, and I offered it to him in exchange for him casting a concealment spell on me. It rendered me invisible to all, undetectable. I followed Tenak and tried to stop him from stealing the sword, but I was too late. His eyebrows pinched. But if you were concealed, how did we see you, and not Tenak? The spell wore off shortly after I fled the castle. I was shifting to pursue my brother when your team found me. He sighed. And attacked you. She shrugged again. I am almost identical to my brother when in my dragon form. It was a mistake. Knowing how angry the elves were with my brother, I should have remained in my mortal form and slipped away from the realm before risking shifting. I was in a hurry, though. He twirled a strand of her hair around his fingers and thumbed the tip, flicking it back and forth. I am glad you escaped. Probably not as glad as I am. She managed to smile, then it faded as she thought about what had happened next. I found my brother, and he did not suspect me at all. He was quick to tell me the full extent of his plans, and he forced me to go with him to a demon village. I thought he was going into hiding. I did not expect... He used the sword there. When I saw him cutting down hundreds of demon warriors with it, I knew what I had to do. I waited until he was asleep, and I stole it, igniting his rage and shattering his trust. You tried to return it. She nodded. I knew he would stop at nothing to reclaim what he now viewed as his property, his prized possession. The dragon need to protect our treasure is powerful, easily rules us and turns us against even those we love with all of our hearts. I knew that only the elves had the strength to fight my brother, so I tried to bring the sword back. We attacked you. Again. He closed his eyes, his nostrils flared, and he huffed. I am sorry, Taryn. He flicked his eyes open, and they leaped between hers, a beautiful look of sorrow mixed with an apology in them, a touch of tenderness that soothed her. I ordered that assault. If I had given you a chance... She pressed her finger to his lips to silence him. Gods, they were warm and firm beneath her fingertip, giving just enough to have her remembering how good they had felt against hers when he had kissed her. You were not to know that I was not returning to destroy your kingdom with the sword. I should have done things differently, but I had been panicked and in a hurry. Her eyebrows furrowed and she stroked her finger off his lips, traced it along the strong line of his jaw, his dark whiskers tickling the tip of it. I should have tried to contact your kin or found another way, one that would have made it clear I meant no harm. Her life was filled with regrets and what might have beens, and she couldn't allow them to take hold of her and drag her down. The past was just that. It was unchangeable. She had to deal with everything that had happened, put it to rest and move forwards. Blue made the thought of doing such a thing seem easy when he wrapped his arms around her, holding her close to him, a contented edge to his expression that his feelings backed up. He enjoyed holding her like this, laying with her and talking, spending time with her. It was such a contrast to how things had always been between them. No war, only peace. "What did you do after that?" he whispered, his voice too husky and low, telling her he was beginning to think ahead too, to a very short time into the future if the hungry edge to his gaze was anything to go by. He wanted her again. Heat pooled in her belly, her blood growing hot at the thought of making love with him again. She fought the need that rolled through her and focused on their conversation, wanting to finish it now that she had started. She wanted to climb on top of Blue and satisfy him, but she needed this even more. "I hid from my brother, constantly on the move. But when I grew tired of running from both him and you, I found the witch again and asked him to cast a concealment spell on the sword. I gave him every drop of gold, every jewel, all of my treasure in exchange for a shot at living." The soft look that entered Blue's violet eyes said that he knew how difficult that must have been for her, but he couldn't imagine the half of it. Parting with her treasure had been like cutting off a limb, or tearing out her own heart with her claws. It had left her lost and weak, vulnerable. "I gave the sword to Loki when I began to fear Tenak was growing close to finding me, and after I encountered you in that dragon village." "That was 300 years ago." She nodded. "Loki concealed the sword for me, using his magic to cast a different enchantment on it." "What happened after that?" Taryn averted her gaze, unable to look at him. "I was captured by slavers." "Fuck," he breathed, and the force behind that word conveyed everything that ran through their bond from him. Anger, disbelief, regret. His arms tightened around her, and he crushed her to his chest. She didn't resist him when he clasped the back of her head and pulled her down to him. She settled her cheek on his chest and closed her eyes, absorbing his warmth and how good it felt to be held like this, wrapped safely in his arms. She nestled closer and flinched when pain stabbed her. Blue tensed, his hand halting halfway through stroking up her shoulder towards his bite mark on her throat. "What is wrong?" She sighed and appreciated his concern, even though it was misplaced. It wasn't her throat that had hurt. He had no reason to feel guilty. Taryn placed her hand on his chest, breathed in time with him, and listened to his heart beating strongly against her ear. "I'm still a little sore." He was silent for a moment, his fingers twitching against her shoulder, and she could feel his confusion and guilt through their bond. It faded a little as she focused on their link, trying to grow accustomed to it. The confusion disappearing, but the guilt lingering. She could almost sense he had realized what she was saying, and that it had nothing to do with him biting her. "I am sorry. I tried to be gentle." Those soft words curled around her and gave her comfort, but they pained him too, and she couldn't ignore that. She pushed herself up and gazed down at him, right into his rich purple eyes. "You do not need to apologize. I was not complaining. It is not an unpleasant sort of soreness." She couldn't quite believe she had just said that, but any foolishness she felt fled when his eyes darkened, his pupils dilating, and heat washed through him and through her too. Taryn leaned in and kissed him, unable to deny the desire rising within her, the need for an encore and the hunger to learn more about this male. Her male. His hands leaped to her backside and he dragged her up his bare body, pinned her to him and kissed her harder. She sank against him and gave herself over to her passion, stroking the seam of his lips with her tongue and begging entrance. He opened for her, and the moment their tongues touched, bright light surrounded her. It dropped away a heartbeat later, leaving her blinded. Only sound came to her, the clash of metal, the agonized bellows of males. Scent joined it, the tinny odor of blood. Her vision returned, and she gasped as she saw the battle spread below her, engulfing the rolling plains as far as her eyes could see. Smoke billowed from the broken pale towers of a castle to her left. Fire blazed across the lands in the distance. The once verdant earth was churned with blood beneath the boots of the warriors. Elves and demons clashed with dragons and demons on the battlefield. The Elf Kingdom. Terran! Terran! Blue's voice pierced the screams and roars filling her ears. She blinked and the vision faded, her world going dark for a few seconds before Blue's face appeared before her. He was shaking. She frowned, realized that she was the one trembling all over as she clutched his shoulders, her short claws pressing into his muscles. His eyes searched hers, and he didn't ask her what had happened or whether she'd had a vision. He came right out and asked, "What did you see?" She blinked again, her heart still pounding against her chest, her thoughts jumbled as she tried to gather her wits. Her pulse slowed as Blue breathed steadily beneath her, and she realized he was the one doing it, helping to calm her by using their link to control her. Part of her fought against him, rebelled against the idea of anyone having power over her. The rest melted into him, sought the comfort of his embrace, and tried to piece back together the quiet calm that had just shattered. "Tenak will attack the Elf Kingdom. I saw the castle in ruin. The battlefield drenched in the blood of demons, elves, and dragons." Blue snarled. "Never." She wished she shared his confidence, but all she knew was fear as she recalled the things she had seen. So much death, so much destruction. The thought that Tenak was bringing it to the Elf Kingdom chilled her blood. It was her fault. Blue eased her up into a sitting position and stood. Black leather trousers appeared on his legs, and he hastily fastened the laces. She stared blankly at his thighs, ears ringing with screams and roars and the clash of swords. "Terran!" he snapped, rousing her from her stupor. He held his hand out to her, the steely determination flashing in his eyes, giving her a sliver of strength and hope, enough that she found the will to lift her hand and place it into his. He pulled her onto her feet, tugged her against his bare chest, and looked down at her. "We have to move. You will be safe, I swear it, but we have to return." She looked around her at the cave, and when she looked back at Blue, he was gazing at the blanket and lantern, a faraway look in his eyes. It was difficult for him, and gods, it was difficult for her too. She didn't want to return to the world either. She had been happy here, lost in Blue. But both of them knew what had to be done. Neither of them could allow her brother to bring harm to the elves. She called her violet leather trousers and her white corset, forming them over her body, and then her boots, and nodded. The resolve in Blue's eyes was only made more reassuring when a black sword appeared in his left hand, and he banded his right arm around her waist. "I will not allow anyone to hurt you, or anything to happen to you. I swear that, Terran." His fingers flexed around the hilt of his blade. She knew in her heart that he would protect her, even if it meant fighting his own people. She knew he would do anything for her, because she would do anything for him. She looked up into his eyes as he tucked her close to his bare chest. Her beautiful, breathtaking mate, her dark warrior. The desire in his eyes echoed through her, and she didn't resist when he dipped his head and claimed her lips in a searing kiss that was both passionate and comforting, meant to convey something she already knew deep in her heart. He wouldn't let her go now that he had her. Chapter 27. The darkness evaporated to reveal the courtyard of the castle, and Blue's grip on the sword instantly tightened, his entire body tensing in preparation as he faced off against a line of soldiers with arrows trained on him. And Terran. He growled low in his throat and drew Terran closer to him, shielding her as best he could. An urge to teleport away from this place with her bolted through him, but he tamped it down, wrestled his instincts as her mate under control, and stood firm. He ran a quick assessing gaze over the elves before him, around him. They formed a square, 2 rows deep, crossing the pale gravel paths and beneath the lush green trees on the 4 sections of grass between them, the front one kneeling while the back row stood. All in all, close to 100 armored elves had arrows pointed at his mate. He narrowed his eyes as he swept them back over the line from his left to his right, searching for any weak spots in their ranks. A few arrowheads wobbled. a sign that elf feared attacking him. As the seconds ticked by, more began to shake. They knew their offense was futile. He could teleport in the blink of an eye and have half of their numbers cut down before they could release a single arrow. If he wanted to attack them. He didn't. Not even to satisfy the dark part of his soul that demanded they pay in blood for threatening his female. He tugged that female closer, using the feel of her pressed against him to soothe his more dangerous side, keeping it under control. Gods, he wanted to slaughter them all. The darkness Terran had purged from his soul in that isolated cave began to creep back in, and he flashed sharp fangs at several of the stronger elves, unable to stop himself from threatening them back as it rose to seize control. He fought it, tried to fill his mind with light, with thoughts of Terran. But this time it only made the darkness grow stronger. She was in danger. These males meant to harm her. She trembled against him, their incomplete bond relaying her fear, but also the instincts that were starting to rise in her too, birthing a hunger for violence and bloodshed that was as terrible as his own. She wanted to fight these males for daring to threaten him. She needed to protect him. Now that the drugs had completely left his system, he could feel the bond more clearly. And as he stood in the castle courtyard facing down 100 soldiers and watching more pouring into the area, he could feel the strength that flowed through him, flowed from Terran into him. Under normal circumstances, an incomplete bond would weaken an elf male because they were usually more powerful than their mate. His incomplete bond with Terran only made him stronger because she was the more powerful one. It was a little emasculating to say the least, but he was going to roll with it because right now having that added strength gave him a shot at protecting her. He scanned the soldiers again and snarled when his eyes settled on one just off to his left. The male's eyes were locked on Terran, the fingers hooked around the string of the bow pulling back slightly, bringing it into a position where he would release it and send the deadly bolt at Blue's mate. Blue's chest grew tight, the darkness beginning to squeeze the light from his soul as it seized hold of him, swamping everything until all he could feel, all he knew, was a terrible urge for bloodshed that chilled his blood even as it made it burn. Black tendrils snaked around his soul and squeezed, sending jagged thorns deep into it that poisoned his mind, driving all rational thought from it and leaving only a wicked hunger behind, a need to deal justice to the male who dared to threaten his mate. A red veil began to descend. "Stand down!" A familiar male voice rang through the tense silence, the commanding edge to it brooking no argument. Blue refused to heed that order. It wasn't the first time he had ignored such a demand from this male, and it wouldn't be the last. He tightened his grip on his sword and on Terran, his eyes never leaving the male who was still preparing to fire on her. "I said stand down," the other male barked. Every soldier in the courtyard immediately turned to face the direction of the castle and dropped to one knee, lowering their weapons and their heads at the same time. Every soldier except that one male. His violet gaze remained fixed on Terran. Blue bared his fangs, daring the bastard to try and cut his female down. He would be breathing blood before he could release the fucking arrow, his guts pierced by Blue's blade. A black-clawed hand materialized out of the air, grabbed the shaft of the arrow as the male finished drawing it back, and snapped it in two. "It is not wise to disobey me," Lauren snarled, and whatever dark spell the male had been under shattered. He dropped to his knees and bent his head. "I will deal with you later." Lauren looked down the line of his straight nose at the soldier, an imperious look that Blue had been on the receiving end of too many times to count over the 4,000 years they had known each other. Lauren's clear amethyst eyes slid towards Blue and narrowed, darkening by degrees. "As for you—" He tensed, waiting for the reprimand he could feel coming, one that would be followed by an order to return Terran to the cells. He had disobeyed his prince in front of the entire castle, and Lauren couldn't go easy on him. He knew that. This time, Lauren would have to punish him for his insubordination. He could damn well throw him in the cell with Terran then, because he wasn't leaving her side when so many soldiers were lifting their heads to look at her again, the desire to strike her down still shining in their cold eyes. Dacian has just finished explaining the situation to me, Lauren said, and Blue frowned as he glanced beyond his prince to the large warrior male, where he stood near the entrance of the castle with Finn and Leif flanking him. Dacian nodded and Blue returned it. He would have to thank the male later. Right now, he needed a moment to take in and comprehend the fact that he wasn't about to get his arse handed to him by the elf prince slowly turning to face him, his dark expression softening. Lauren's gaze fell to Terran, and Blue barely bit back the growl that rumbled around his chest. His prince's violet eyes lifted to him again, and Blue didn't like the knowing edge his smile had gained. Before Blue could scowl at him in silent warning not to say a word about his situation, Lauren turned around and looked over the soldiers kneeling around him. Lauren tipped his chin up and clasped his hands behind his back, resting them against the tails of his crisp dark purple knee-length jacket. Blue curled his lip at the silver embroidery on the square tails and across the shoulders. His damned prince had chosen the jacket on purpose, wearing one that depicted dragons and elves. Lauren knew she was something to him, and this was his way of sneakily teasing him. Mischievous bastard. "The female is no threat to us," Lauren announced, and all thoughts of tackling him to the ground and beating him into a bloody pulp dissipated. "She is a guest and will be treated as such. Understood?" Every elf in the courtyard made a noise of affirmation. Every elf except Blue. He could only stare at Lauren, deeply aware that he owed his prince a huge one for what he had done for him and Terran. Lauren looked back over his shoulder at him, his eyes relaying a silent command. Blue nodded, released Terran, and then took hold of her hand. He curled his free hand around the leather hilt of his black sword, refusing to send it away or even sheath it. He had a promise to keep. Nerve still flowed through his link to Terran, fear that was yet to fade as she stood close to him, wary violet to white eyes on the soldiers surrounding them. Her grip on his hand was firm, almost painful, relaying her need for comfort. He shifted his hand and slipped his fingers between hers, linking them together in a stronger way, and she glanced up at him. Gods, it was difficult to resist looking at her, but he couldn't let his guard down, and taking his eyes off the males surrounding them would be doing just that, leaving them open to attack. He followed Lauren as the male swept towards the castle, the soldiers in his way parting to allow him through, his long strides quickly covering the pale path that intersected the orchard. A few of the soldiers glanced up as Blue passed with Terran, and he hissed at all of them, his pointed ears flattening against the sides of his head, a show of aggression that was impossible to deny. Lauren's boots were silent on the polished pale stone floor as they entered the castle. Blue's steps were equally as light, but Terran's footfalls echoed around the glittering stone walls of the broad corridor. Her fear turned to fascination as they left the soldiers behind and ventured deeper into the quiet castle, and her eyes began to dart around to take in her surroundings. He looked at her now, unable to deny the urge any longer, watching her as she studied everything with eyes that sparkled, as if everything she saw was treasure. Maybe it was the way the walls glittered, the carved columns at intervals along the corridor shining like stars as they passed, and the stone caught the shifting light. Her eyes drifted over every statue, but lingered on the one near the grand arched wooden doors as two soldiers dressed in full black armor, their helmets in place, opened them for Lauren. Her steps slowed. Her gaze leaped from the statue to the male who had entered the chamber ahead of them and then to Blue. "It is he," she whispered in the dragon tongue. "My prince." He shrugged casually when she gaped at him, blinked, tossed a look at Lauren's back that was part astonishment, part wonder. "He is not what I expected." She looked back at the statue and then at Lauren, as if expecting the two not to match all of a sudden. Had she expected Lauren to be a cruel-looking male because he ruled a kingdom? A monster? "He is a good male, Terran. He will listen to what we have to say." He squeezed her hand, and her gaze finally leaped back to him. Fear rose up in her again as voices rang around the room ahead of them, and it trickled through him, too. The elders. He hadn't expected them to be present when he spoke with Lauren. He schooled his features when Taryn flicked him a glance, not letting her see that fear. She needed to see him strong right now, confident and courageous, certain that he could clear her name with his prince and the elves across the entire kingdom. He sent his sword back to his apartment above them, hoping it would show her that she had no reason to fear because he wasn't afraid. The way she squeezed his hand back and a little sigh escaped her reminded him that any attempt to conceal his nerves from her was futile, since she could sense them in him. His gaze dropped to her and then shifted to the left side of her throat. The marks he had placed on her were still angry red around their edges. His eyes shot down to his boots. Taryn's grip on his hand tightened and he reached for their link, needing to feel her and know that she had forgiven him. He needed it more than anything, because she was fast becoming everything to him. Blue. Lauren's deep voice echoed with authority through the archway. Blue sucked down a breath, held it, and exhaled slowly. He glanced down at Taryn, checking she was ready. She smoothed her hair, concealing the marks on her throat, her little smile relaying that she had sensed his secret desire to keep them hidden from the people who awaited them. When she nodded, he released her hand and strode forwards with her at his side. She tensed as they entered the grand chamber, and this time it had nothing to do with the stunning sight that surrounded them, and everything to do with the 3 elder elves standing off to the left of the platform on which Lauren stood. Their long black robes reached the floor, a thick embroidered purple sash binding their waists, the only touch of color, and one that did nothing to alleviate the austere edge they shared. Few elves could boast to have lived as long as these 3, and they knew it. It was there in their violet eyes as they watched him approach with Taryn at his side, an air of smugness that he wanted to wipe off their faces by showing them that age and wisdom that came from books meant little on the battlefield. The bloody fields of war were an arena for the strong of mind and body, those forged in the fiery crucible and taught tactics, savagery, and skill through the harsh lessons that brought them close to the embrace of death. He had learned everything he knew in such an arena, and it had molded him into a male who could easily see through their polished appearances and their air of condescension and self-righteousness to the fact that beneath their facades they shared one common feeling. They were afraid. They feared that their grip on Lauren was weakening, and soon their voices would no longer hold sway over him. Because Blue wasn't the only male in this grand room who had been shaped by war, taught hard lessons and survived. Lauren had been there with him, but his skill as a commander on the battlefield was matched by his skill as a prince of his people, a male of knowledge and understanding, and one who could easily rule without 3 crones whispering in his ear. Blue had fought enough battles to know that their fear of losing power over Lauren would make them desperate. They would make one last fight for power, one last stand to prove themselves still valuable, and that they still had control. That was the reason they were here now. They meant to use Taryn as their pawn to regain power over Lauren, over his dead body, or theirs. He would cut them all down if they so much as looked at her wrongly. If they made any attempt to seize her or harm her, he would rip their still-beating hearts from their chests. "Approach," Lauren said, and Blue led Taryn up the aisle between the rows of ornately carved white wooden pews. Her eyes didn't leave the group that waited ahead of her as she passed each thick, towering black column that supported the vaulted ceiling of the chamber. Blue's did. He looked down at her where she walked at his side, steady and strong, bravely striding forwards even when he could sense her fear. The light that streamed in through the tall arched windows on either side of the long room washed over her as she emerged from the shadow of each elegantly carved column, flickering across her face and making her almost glow. Fuck, she was beautiful. Afraid yet fearless. She walked with her chin tipped up, her head held high, a sharpness to her eyes and a snap to her step that made him want to growl low in his throat in appreciation of his mate, his fierce little dragon. What did she look like to the 3 old bastards loitering at Lauren's side? Her violet to white hair was still stained with blood, and black dirt smeared her exposed skin. She looked as if she had been through a war and emerged the only victor, and was ready to slay anyone else who stood in her way. Damn. He wanted her. A touch of color stained her cheeks, turning her too pale skin rosy. Her gaze flitted his way, dark hunger growing in it, and then jumped back to the trio of elders and then locked on Lauren. The blush remained, even grew darker. She knew his wicked thoughts. Fuck, that only made him want her more. He stifled a grimace as his cock twitched, sucked down a deep breath, and clawed back control. A meeting with Lauren and the elders was no time to get a raging hard-on for his mate, especially when he wanted to keep that little fact from as many as he could until everything was settled. Until she was his. Mine. He couldn't stop himself from thinking it as she walked beside him, marching down the aisle in a room that had recently held the grand ceremony of Lauren's marriage to his mate Olivia. When they reached the raised stone platform at the end of the aisle, he halted with Taryn and looked up into Lauren's eyes. "You appear to have lost something." Lauren gestured towards his wrists. Blue pressed his right palm to his bare chest and lowered his head. "My apologies, my prince. The gift you gave to me was taken from me, and I could not risk retrieving them. It was too dangerous." He could almost feel Lauren's smile, as warm as the light that washed over him from the windows. "Then you made the right decision. Such trinkets have no value compared to the worth of your life," Lauren said and paused before sighing. "But I do know they meant much to you. I cannot restore them, but I can offer replacements." Blue closed his eyes, feeling that warmth seeping into his bones, and soothing away the weariness that he hadn't realized was there, lightening the heaviness that had been with him since losing his armor. Lauren was too damn wise for his own good sometimes, able to see things that Blue couldn't, even when they were things about himself that he should have known. His prince was right, and his armor had meant a lot to him. Lauren had bestowed it on him over 4,000 years ago, a gift that had been part of the ceremony to celebrate his ascension to the rank of commander. Losing it had left a piece of him missing, and while he couldn't get that piece back right now, maybe he could in the future, after they had dealt with the dragon who had stolen it from him. He sensed Lauren's gaze leave him and lifted his head, and had to bite his tongue to stop himself from growling at the male when he found him looking at his mate. Lauren flicked him a pointed look, a hint of a smile, and then back towards his tall-backed white oak throne. He seated himself, crossed his legs, and settled his arms on the ornately carved rests. "I believe you have a report for me." Lauren looked from him to Taryn and back again, before his eyes shot beyond him and shone brighter. A little smile curled his lips as he watched the person who had entered behind Blue approach, his pupils dilating and the pointed tips of his ears flaring back against his neat, short, blue-black hair. Blue didn't need to look to know who was on the receiving end of his prince's attention, but he had to wonder whether he wore the same stupid expression whenever he looked at Taryn. Something between passionate lover and lovesick fool. Everything in him said to glance at Taryn, but he kept his eyes fixed on Lauren, charting the subtle shift from sentimental idiot to darkly possessive and hungry male as Olivia swept into view to Blue's right and ascended the few steps up to the platform where her mate waited. Impatiently. Blue could practically feel Lauren's eagerness. Maybe it was his own damn hunger rising to the fore again, flooding him with a need that echoed the one on Lauren's face. That hunger made him want to growl when Lauren held out a hand to Olivia. She placed hers into it, and he drew her down to him for a fierce kiss. Gods damn him. He did glance at Taryn now, filled with a desperate need to kiss her like that too, laced with jealousy that his prince could openly do such a thing with his mate, when he had to stand here with his and resist taking her into his arms as he wanted. Fuck did he want that. He wanted her against him again, her warmth seeping into him, her lips on his as she moaned and writhed, hungry for more of him, more that he would give her. He wouldn't stop until she was boneless and sated, unable to move from his arms. Too weak to break free of his hold, too in love with him to leave him. She had to be his. Mine. It rang in every fiber of his being, every drop of his blood and ounce of his soul. He hadn't realized he had growled until Lauren cleared his throat and snapped him back to the room. Taryn stared up at him, her cheeks flushed, eyes dark with hunger. He trembled with a need to satisfy that desire, to whisk her away to somewhere they could be alone and could make love for hours. It was only the feel of the elders' gazes on him that had him turning away from her and facing his prince again. He shut down his feelings, pushing them all back down inside, and focused on the reason he was here, clearing her name. He curled his fingers into fists and cursed the heat of Taryn beside him, radiating from her and warming his skin on his left side, making him too aware of her when he had to concentrate. How much power did she hold over him? It was getting difficult to think straight, to keep his mind on anything other than taking her into his arms, bending her over backwards and kissing the breath from her. He forced himself to speak, using the dragon tongue. "Taryn, you just need to tell Prince Lorne and the council what you told me." She lifted her striking eyes to him, nodded despite the nerves he could feel flowing through her, and then turned away. She bravely stepped forwards, facing the elders and his prince, where he sat on his pale throne, Olivia seated on the smaller one beside him. As Taryn spoke, Olivia stared not at her but at him, and he glanced across at her, catching the warmth in her dark eyes. She looked well, rested for once. Had she been spending more time at the castle with Lauren and less spent traveling between the elf kingdom and her work with Archangel in the mortal realm? Her chestnut hair tumbled around her shoulders, gold threads highlighting it as the warm light spilled over her from the left, bright on her pale blue dress. She looked down at the silver metal corset constructed of elaborate swirls, raised an eyebrow at it, and then lifted her brown eyes back to meet his, and sighed in a way that told him exactly what she thought about elf fashion for females. He almost smiled as he remembered her tirade about how uncomfortable their corsets and dresses were, and how much she hated them and wanted to wear her mortal clothing of jeans and t-shirts, and how Lauren had desperately fought to convince his stubborn mate that dressing in such a feminine and elven fashion would help her people accept her as their princess. A deep growl echoed through the room. From his left, Olivia's eyes widened and darted there. Blue looked down at Taryn. She had stepped forwards, her hands clenched at her sides, her eyes locked on Olivia and her teeth bared, every one of them sharp. Violet scales rippled over her bare skin. Blue hastily caught her arm and spun her to face him. She glared up at him, one that froze him with its intensity and the promise of painful death. What the hell had he done to deserve her looking at him as if she was contemplating bloody murder? His eyes widened and he quickly glanced at Olivia. He had been staring at another female. It shouldn't have warmed him, but it did. Heated him right down to his marrow and the pit of his soul. His little female was jealous, and that jealousy was revealing. She had feelings for him. Her pretty face darkened and she flashed those killer teeth at him instead. Beneath his hand, her soft skin grew hard, tough scales that were cool to the touch. He rubbed his thumb over an exposed patch of pink skin, hoping that Lauren and the others couldn't see the caress. "She is a wild thing," the tallest of the elders said in the elf tongue, and swept his long hair back from his right shoulder. "She should be detained." Taryn turned to look at the one who had spoken, and Blue growled at the male, baring his fangs in warning. She couldn't understand their language, and while part of him was glad of that because the male had dared to speak of placing her in a cell, the rest of him was pissed as all hell. "She came here of her own free will, and she will not be placed in a cage," Blue snarled in the elf language, and Lauren shot him a look that ordered him to back down. He ignored his prince and stepped past Taryn, using his hand on her arm to guide her behind him. "You may try, but I warn you, you will fail." "Enough!" Lauren barked, and Taryn flinched behind him. Blue came dangerously close to turning his growl on his prince. Only the feel of Taryn pressing closer to him stopped him, calming him enough that he could retain control and tamp down the urge to lash out at Lauren for frightening her. "No one will be placing anyone in a cage or fighting anyone. Understood?" Lauren stood and glared at the elders and then at Blue. Blue dropped his chin and pressed his right hand back against his chest, thankful his prince had spoken in the elven tongue, so Terran wouldn't hear mention of cages. "Understood." The elders mumbled their responses. Lauren huffed and spoke in English this time. "Now, I believe the female was telling us important facts before you had the audacity to stare at my mate for so long." Darkness rolled through the room, power so intense that Blue's knees shook from the force of it as it battered him. "Lauren," Olivia chided, and Blue made a mental note to thank her later when Lauren wasn't in such a poor mood and liable to kill him for merely looking at his mate. It seemed he wasn't the only one badly affected by a bond, but Lauren's was complete, his mate secure. What hope did Blue have of restoring some sanity in his life if completing the bond hadn't freed Lauren of his need to cut down any male who looked at his female for too long? Olivia was plain in comparison to Terran. Terran would draw the gazes of males no matter where they went, everything that was beautiful and unique about her making it impossible for her to move through the realms without attracting attention. The thought of constantly feeling on edge, convinced that one of those males might steal her from him, had him on the verge of growling again. Her hand settled against his bare back. Feelings flowed through their link, comfort and calm that he knew wasn't something she truly felt, but something she was feeling in order to offer it to him in silence. She stepped out from behind him, her fingers trailing from his back, slipping from his skin and leaving him bereft, and he stared down at her as she continued to talk, telling Lauren of her brother and what she had seen in a vision. Lauren's expression turned grave and pensive, and Olivia placed her right hand over his on the arm of his throne, curling her fingers around to brush his palm, offering Lauren comfort just as Terran had for him. The longer Lauren stared at Terran, lost deep in thought as he mulled over what she had told him, the stronger the urge to fight him became, until all Blue could think about was launching forwards, wrapping his hands around his prince's throat, and throttling him until he swore to never look at her again. Gods, he was fucked. It was rare, damn near unheard of, for an incomplete bond to view even a mated male as a threat, but that was exactly what he felt as he watched Lauren staring at his damned mate. He wanted to gouge the bastard's eyes out with his thumbs. Blue ground his teeth and pinned his gaze on the floor in front of his boots, breathed through the darkness that clogged his lungs and clawed at his heart. The voices of Terran and Lauren swirled around him, their words twisting in his ears into new ones, whispers of illicit lovers caught deep in a passionate tryst. He curled his fingers into fists, dug his nails into his palms, and wished he had his armor. He wanted his claws. He needed them. "Blue?" Terran's soft voice pierced the dark veil that had descended over his mind, a shaft of light that chased the shadows back. He exhaled hard, releasing the breath he hadn't realized he was holding, and looked at her, his strength draining from him together with the tension, as it left his body and the images of Lauren and Terran locked in a wicked embrace. He stared blankly at her, feeling empty, lost. He needed to get away from this place. He needed to get far away from everyone. He was too dangerous right now, on edge and unfit to be around any male when Terran was present. "I will send men to speak with the third king, as this dragon Tenak will strike those lands first, in order to reach the elf kingdom," Lauren announced in English, filling the thick silence, giving Blue a moment to pull himself back together. Blue expected to feel a reaction to the mention of Thorn, but he felt nothing. It dawned on him that whatever he had felt for Sable, the mortal female now mated to Thorn, it was nothing compared with what he felt for Terran. He stared at his little dragon, and a blush climbed her cheeks. When he felt Lauren's gaze on him, he dragged his eyes away from her and faced his prince. "I will relay that order, and also issue notice to the first and second realms." He needed a moment to breathe, a few minutes to an hour in which he could find his balance again and master his turbulent feelings. Terran would be safe under Lauren's protection. As soon as she was settled somewhere away from danger, he would leave for the demon realms, returning as quickly as possible to her. Hopefully as a male able to be around another male without wanting to rip their throat out. Lauren shook his head. Another will do that task. You are to find quarters for our guest, perhaps on the second level." Blue frowned at his prince. Lorne was meddling. He had known the male for over 40 centuries, and he was atrocious at hiding it when he was up to mischief. It was right there in his violet eyes. He was placing Terran on the second level, because Blue's quarters were there and there was a vacant one right next door. "The third floor would be a better choice," Blue shot back. "It is quieter, and few reside there. The female might like some peace and some space away from us elves." His prince folded his arms across his chest, firmly shook his head, and barely contained the damned smile Blue knew wanted out. "No, I am sure the female will feel safest closest to you." Blue could almost feel Terran's blush, or maybe it was his own damned one. Lauren's lips were finally stronger than his will, and they curled at the corners. Beside him, Olivia openly grinned. Blue scowled at both of them. "Very well, my prince." He turned on his heel and stormed down the aisle between the pale wooden pews, barely leashing his desire to grab Terran's arm to drag her with him. When he reached the arched door, he shoved it open and strode out into the corridor, and couldn't bring himself to move any further. The distance between him and Terran already felt too great. It tugged him back to her, filling him with a sensation that unsettled him. It felt as if he had left his heart behind. Chapter 28. Blue paced the corridor, taking swift, agitated steps across it, ignoring the 2 guards watching him as he waited for Terran. She appeared in the arched doorway, and he immediately looked across at her, his steps slowing as he took her in, her beauty hitting him hard all over again, as if he hadn't seen her in weeks, not seconds. She flicked a nervous look at the 2 guards and hurried past them to him. "You will be safe here," he whispered in the dragon tongue, but she didn't look convinced. He glared at the 2 guards, gently caught hold of her arm and led her away, back along the wide corridor towards the entrance of the castle. He turned left before he reached it, leading her up a set of stone steps. Her fingers trailed over the carved balustrade, eyes on the leaves and small animals, avoiding him. Nerves still flowed through her, but this time they weren't born of fear of the other elves in the castle. They were born of fear of being alone with him. The innocence behind those feelings had him pulling her into the vacant room beside his on the second level, kicking the wooden door closed and drawing her into his arms. He placed one hand against the back of her head and guided it to rest against his bare chest. She was still for a moment, but then her arms were around him, palms pressing against his spine, holding him to her. "I do not like that female." He smiled at that. Did she know how jealous she sounded? "Olivia is mated to my prince," he said, and she drew back and frowned up at him, her eyes silently asking him whether that was meant to make a difference. He could hardly say it should when he had threatened Lorne for looking at her. Those knowing eyes leaped between his. "You are going to leave," she whispered, her soft voice laced with a touch of fear and a hint of hurt. "Not for long. I will only go to relay orders to my men and make sure the Demon Kings are warned about your brother." Blue lifted his hand and stroked his knuckles across her cheek. "You will be safe here." Terran cast her gaze around the large room. It mirrored his, with a low line of cabinets against the dark gray stone wall to his right, and wardrobes lining the solid half of the side of the room to his left. Beyond those wardrobes was a huge opening that led into the bathing area. Her eyes settled on the neat double bed directly opposite the door, against a wall lined with 3 tall arched windows that allowed light to flood the room, and widened. Someone had put fresh sheets on the bed, fresh purple sheets. Blue ground his teeth, rubbed his left hand over his face, and cursed Lorne's name in his head. This was taking meddling too far. His prince had already prepared the room for Terran, and had intentionally ordered sheets that matched the beautiful color of her hair and eyes, a deep shade of violet mixed with cream pillows against the wooden headboard. He huffed and stomped across the room towards the bathing room. The huge rectangular pool in the center of it was empty just as he had expected. It seemed Lorne hadn't thought of everything. He strode past the stone basins that lined the wall to his left, the mirrors above them reflecting him and bouncing light from the bedroom across the room, illuminating it together with a chandelier of glowing crystals that hung above the pool set into the floor. He felt Taryn's gaze on him as he crouched at the end opposite the entrance to the bedroom, grasped a thick metal ring, twisted it and pulled upwards, opening the sluice gate. Steaming water thundered into the pool. "It will take time to fill, but be sure to keep an eye on it." He straightened and looked across the pool at her. Her eyes were on the water. Light washed over her right side, casting her left into shadow. She wrapped her arms around herself, and he was striding towards her, long legs devouring the distance between them, before she had even lifted her eyes to him. He pulled her back into his arms and closed his eyes as he held her, feeling her trembling. "I will not be long." He resisted the temptation to press a kiss to her hair and tried to think of something he could say to reassure her. He looked back at the pool. The water was barely an inch deep now. He clutched Taryn's shoulders, gently eased her back, and then caught her under the chin with his left hand and tipped her head up so her eyes met his. "I swear, I will be back before the pool is full." She glanced beyond him to it, something akin to sorrow in her eyes. He found he never wanted her to look so sad again. He wanted her to always smile. He wanted her life to be happy and filled with joy. She deserved that after everything she had been through. It was an impossible dream, though, a desire he could never fulfill, because her brother was coming, and he was bringing war in his wake, and Blue knew that she meant to continue with the mission she had taken on. She meant to stop her brother. Doing so was only going to hurt her, but taking her place as her brother's executioner wouldn't lessen the pain she would feel when her twin was taken from her. He couldn't see any alternative route to stopping the dragon either, no matter how much he wanted to find one. He had no love for the bastard, would gladly end him given the chance, but the thought of hurting Taryn tore at him and made him want to seek another path, one where she wouldn't have to suffer the ordeal of losing the brother she so clearly loved. "The pool is filling fast," she whispered, and raised her eyes to meet his. "You will not keep your promise if you do not leave now." "I know," he husked, captured both of her cheeks in his palms and lowered his head, resting his forehead against hers. "But I cannot leave when you hurt so deeply." She placed her hands over his and smiled. "I am tired. My vision weighs on my heart. That is all. I will rest while you do your work." She pulled back, and the wicked twinkle in her eyes made it even more difficult to drag himself away from her. "You are filthy, too. Perhaps when you return, you should bathe?" He knew what she had meant to say before her nerve had failed her, and he nodded, wanting to growl at her that he was going to take her up on that offer she had wanted to extend to him, suggesting they should bathe together. He backed off and forced himself to turn away, but she caught his wrist and he looked back at her. "Wait." She released him and he frowned, curious as to what she was doing, when she grabbed a square of cloth from near the basin, wetted it, and came back to him. He raised an eyebrow at her as she tiptoed and rubbed the wet cloth over his face, and then his hair and down his neck. She settled back on her heels and preened her fingers through his wet hair in a way that felt too damned good. "There. Now you are more fit to meet with a king." He smiled. Would she ever stop seeing through him? He had worded things in a way he had hoped would make her feel he was remaining in the castle as Lorne had ordered, but she had seen straight through to the truth. He was going to speak with one of them himself. He teleported his leathers away, not bothering to cover himself before he called fresh clothes to him, letting her get a quick flash of him naked. Her heart rate quickened, jacking his up with it, and desire flooded the link between them. "I lied." She rushed out and clenched her hands at her sides, flexed her fingers and curled them again, as if she wanted to grab hold of him and was resisting that desire. "I mean, I did not lie as such, but I meant to say earlier, when I talked about the pool." His smile widened as tight trousers appeared on his legs, hugging his thighs, followed by riding boots, and then his black knee-length jacket. The one with the pale blue embroidery on the two long rectangular tails on the front and the two on the back, around the cuffs and the stand-up collar. The one that he liked to save for special occasions, because it was damned expensive and Lauren had given it to him as a gift. But the cut was incredible, and he thought it emphasized his physique, and he wanted to look handsome enough that his little dragon would want to eat him whole. The hunger that filled Taryn's eyes as she raked them over him said that he had been right to think it. He stepped towards her and husked in a low, gravelly voice, "You were talking about bathing with me." Fierce red colored her cheeks, but then she straightened, looked him right in the eye, and nodded. "I wish to bathe with you." He liked that flash of courage in her eyes, the determination in her stance, and the challenge in her tone. He snaked his arm around her waist, hauled her close to him, and feathered his lips up her throat to her ear and whispered into it, "You scrub my back, and I'll scrub yours." She trembled, a little squeak escaping her, a deliciously feminine sound that he wanted to hear again and again, because it was so at odds with the dangerous side of his powerful little dragon that was all he had ever known. It made him want to stay and learn this new side of her, to learn everything about her, every little thing, leaving nothing hidden. She tipped her head to one side, moaned as he tongued the lobe of her ear, melted against him before bracing her hands against his chest and pushing him back. He growled at her as she broke free of his grip, stealing herself away from him when he was hungry for more of her, and she planted her hands on her hips and glared at him. "The pool is filling." He looked beyond her, cursed when he saw it was almost a quarter full. "Stay here. Do not leave this room. Lock the door." He pulled her to him for a quick, hard kiss that had her gasping into his mouth, and then teleported, intent on keeping his promise to her. He wouldn't break another one. He appeared in the central courtyard and strode towards the arch in the high wall that led to the outer courtyard. The soldiers who had greeted him in a not-so-friendly fashion when he had returned with Taryn were gone, returned to their duties, leaving the orchard quiet. He didn't need more than one shot at guessing where he would find his men. He reached the pale garrison on the other side of the arch and took quick steps down the narrow corridor between the stable block and the main building. A grunt sounded from ahead, and Blue's lips twitched into a smile. Dacian was in his usual place in the arena, fighting Finn for a change while Leif leaned against the wall, propped up on his elbows and shouting suggestions to the younger elf, as he desperately tried to best the big warrior. Good luck with that. Blue had fought Dacian before, and the one time he had won, it had been a hard-fought battle that had left him bedbound with strict orders to rest for 3 days. He shrugged to himself. Dacian had had it worse, though. The medical team had ordered him to rest for 3 weeks. The warrior male had grown close to losing his mind by the time his term in sickbay had finally ended. Blue had never seen a male so glad to get back out onto the battlefield. "Leif," Blue said, and the noble male turned his head and looked over his shoulder at him, before straightening and coming to face him. "I need you to relay information to the first realm of the demons. Finn and Dacian can hit the second realm." The two males in question broke apart and jogged over to him, both breathing hard and sporting a few new wounds. "We are to warn them that Tenak will be passing through their lands. He is amassing an army en route. They need to decide how to act, whether that is evacuating any villages along the path the dragon might take, or fighting him. But warn them that Taryn, this dragon's sister, has seen a vision of them fighting on the side of the elves in our kingdom, in a great battle against her brother." All 3 males frowned at that, and he could see they had questions, but he didn't have time to answer them. The damned pool was probably close to a third full now. Leif's frown stuck. "What of the third realm? The dragon lands are closest to that kingdom." Blue nodded. "I will take care of informing King Thorn." He couldn't send anyone else in his place, no matter what Lauren had ordered. It was his duty to go to the third realm. None of his men had met the demon king who ruled it, but they had met with the first and second kings before, during their previous search for the dragon. He waited for all 3 males to nod and willed his portal, vowing to thank Dacian later when he had more time and they were alone. Green-purple light chased over the contours of his body and the darkness embraced him, cold against his face and hands, and then dissipated to reveal the courtyard of the squat dark stone castle belonging to King Thorn. Part of him had expected his clearance to use the portal that exited in the castle to have been revoked, and to find himself bounced to the nearest public portal or back to the Elf Kingdom. He hadn't exactly been on the best terms with Thorn. He couldn't quite imagine worse ones since they had both been after the same female, Sable. He took a step towards the nearest demon warrior milling around the courtyard, and then stopped when a revelation hit him. He was testing himself. Sable would be with her mate, and part of him needed to know whether seeing her would affect him as it used to, when she had been unmated and even after she had made her choice. The demon swung his way, hefted a great broadsword up onto his wide shoulder, and strode towards him, the huge muscles of his bare torso shifting with each heavy step, and dark brown leathers reflecting the light from the braziers that burned around the courtyard. The male's dusky horns flared, curling from behind his pointed ears and around on themselves, so they resembled those of a ram. It was a sign of aggression in demons. Blue stood his ground. The demon was taller than him by a few inches and broader too, but that didn't mean he was stronger. If the male tried to fight him, he would find that out for himself. "What do you want?" the big male grumbled in broken English. Blue snorted, as if he couldn't speak demon. "I request an audience with King Thorn. I have news from him from the Elf Kingdom, so if you would be so kind as to stop stomping around acting like you own the place, and take me to the male who actually does, I would most appreciate it," he said in the demon tongue, skipping the usual greeting that was often in the form of an insult and earning a deadly glare from the male, one that said he was intelligent enough to recognize he had just been patronized and didn't like it. The male had started it. Blue had only given him a taste of his own medicine. The male's meaty fingers flexed around the hilt of his broadsword. Blue's twitched at his side, ready to call his blade to them if the demon attacked. Another demon strolled over, burgundy leathers creaking as they struggled to remain in one piece over his thick thighs. Blue recognized this one as a commander, a male he had met during the recent war between the Third and Fifth Realm, one he had fought in on the side of the Third. The demon had put on even more muscle in the few months since he had been here, but apparently hadn't thought to purchase larger trousers. "King Thorn will see you." The dark-haired male beckoned him, and Blue followed him across the courtyard, keeping one eye on the other demon so he couldn't get the jump on him. Thorn's castle was nothing like Lauren's. It lacked the grandeur of the elf palace, with no conical towers to spear the dark sky. To Blue's eyes, it resembled a stumpy, heavily fortified gray garrison. Stout curved walls enclosed the inner courtyard, with one arched gate off to his left. At intervals along the wall, square three-story buildings intersected it, the final level at the same height as the battlements. The demons patrolling the walls walked through those levels and appeared out the other side, huge swords and spears resting on their bare shoulders. Another difference from his own home, where no one roamed the walls unless an alarm was sounded. Here the demons seemed to actively await war, almost as if they were wishing it would come to them. They probably never had to wait long, a century at most, often less. The 7 demon realms were always at war with each other over something, playing a constant tug-of-war for the lands they shared. Blue turned his focus back to the squat 3-story building ahead of him. This one had a huge arched entrance, and arched windows on the 2nd and 3rd levels glowed with amber light. It wasn't square like the others. It curved with the wall, with what looked like an addition to his right where the windows were smaller. They were the quarters of the officers and the king, a place where he had stayed during the war with the 5th realm. The 2nd level extended on the left too, but only to form a balcony, with an elegant stone balustrade that seemed out of place in such a roughly hewn castle. Small fire pits burned around the walls of the courtyard, with larger ones dotted around the center, chasing back the darkness that passed as evening light this far from the Elf Kingdom. Hell would be a black place indeed without the light his kin brought into it. That light bled over into the demon realms and the free realm, giving them a sort of day. For some damned reason, the demons called it night. He never had figured out why. His demon escort led him through the arched entrance of the main building. Torches protruded from the carved columns and illuminated the vaulted hallway, and the corridors that extended off from it to his left and his right. He followed the male through the second archway and into the grand hall of the castle. 2 rows of 3 thick stone columns rose up on either side of the aisle, supporting the vaulted ceiling. The torches slotted into black metal brackets struggled to illuminate the huge space, their warm light catching on the 12 stone columns and casting shadows in all directions around the windowless room. Another marked difference to the elf castle. This was more of a war room than a ceremonial one. Defensive, not decorative. Dull, if you asked him. He preferred the brightness and beauty of the grand hall in his own castle. There weren't even any pews in this one, nowhere for visiting parties to rest. Everyone had to stand to speak with the demon in charge. The kinglet lounged on the elaborate black throne at the end of the aisle on a raised platform, 2 braziers on the back corners of it illuminating the huge tapestry that hung on the rear wall, a depiction of war. Typical of a demon to think war was beautiful enough to hang it on his wall. Thorn lowered his right leg, removing it from his left knee, and the sound of his boot striking the black stone of the platform rang around the room. Oaf. Demons lacked finesse and grace. They stomped around, growled and roared, and lost their temper over the slightest thing. The third king sat up, his broad bare chest rippling with muscle and power, as he straightened on his black throne and eyed Blue with dark red eyes that rapidly began to burn crimson. Case in point, he had barely been in the demon's presence for 3 seconds, hadn't even opened his mouth to tell the brute why he was here, and the male was already on the verge of attacking him. Movement to the king's left drew Blue's focus there. A slender, black-haired mortal female dressed in obsidian leather trousers, knee-high boots, and a tight black T-shirt emerged from the shadows and patted Thorn's shoulder in a soothing manner, her amber eyes fixed on her mate. Sable. The expected ache in his heart didn't come. It no longer hurt when he looked at her, because it was aching to see Taryn again, and that yearning was far stronger than any he had ever felt for Sable. The huntress had been right all those months ago. What he had felt for her hadn't really been love, because although it had hurt him when she had chosen Thorn over him, the pain he had experienced then would be nothing compared with how he would feel if he lost Taryn. If she rejected him, he wouldn't be able to bounce back from it. He would die. The demon Sable petted growled low, a rumbling sound of warning that Blue heeded. As much as he enjoyed fighting Thorn, he wasn't here to do battle, nor was he here to fight over Sable. He was here to deliver a message. 2 messages, one on behalf of his kingdom and the other on behalf of himself. He would deal with that one first, and quickly, because that damned pool was probably almost full, and he meant to keep his promise to Taryn. "An angel has been sighted in the Dragon Realm," he said, and Sable's golden eyes widened. Thorn growled again, eyes blazing like fire as he leaned forwards, his dark claws emerging as he curled his fingers over the ends of the armrests of his throne. "An angel." The big male bared his fangs on a snarl. "What business does an angel have in hell?" What indeed? Angels never entered hell. It stripped them of most of their strength and crippled them with pain if the rumors were anything to go by. "The echelon," Sable whispered, a frown pinching her fine black eyebrows as she stared at the floor, gaze fixed but distant. Thorn looked up at her. "The one from Archangel." She swallowed hard, glanced at her mate with fear in her eyes, and then at Blue. "He said something to Amelia when he came for me. Something about tracking down the dragon who had hurt her and slaying it." "Well, he is wreaking havoc in the Dragon Realm, so I would suggest you remain away from that place." Blue ran his hand over his hair, blew out his breath, and held her gaze, not hiding his concern from her. "Sable will be safe here." Thorn rose onto his feet, towering over Blue on the raised platform. "But we thank you for the information. You may leave now." The russet-haired male was a good few inches taller than him without the added height of the platform, and while such a tactic would have worked on him once, intimidating him and making him itch to fight the bastard for thinking he could look down on him, it didn't bother him at all this time. Sable's golden gaze questioned him. He knew he was acting differently. Before, he would have been curt and would have left straight after delivering his message to spare himself the pain of seeing her with Thorn. Now he wanted to leave so he could return to Taryn. "I am not done," he said, and Sable spoke over him. "You seem well." Blue frowned, thought about what she had said, and then rolled his shoulders beneath his dark jacket when he realized that he was. "I am well. I am very well indeed." She smiled slightly. "I'm glad to hear that." Thorn grumbled something in the demon tongue and looked close to snagging his mate's arm and pulling her nearer to him. Sable tossed her mate a chiding look. The big demon king folded his meaty arms across his chest, narrowed his red gaze on Blue, and drew down a deep breath, stilled, grinned in a manner Blue didn't like. "Does your improved mood have anything to do with the dragon I can smell all over you?" Thorn's grin stretched wider as he preened the dark horns that curled from behind his ears with the air of a male satisfied with himself. Blue shot him down with a black glare. "Thorn!" Sable snapped and cuffed him across his left shoulder, earning a glare from her mate. She turned her gaze on Blue. "I'm sorry. He's been horribly bored and he's taking it out on everyone. Not a day goes by when he doesn't get himself into some sort of trouble." "You will not be bored soon," Blue said, and the demon's eyes lit up. "The reason I came here was because a dragon has the elven sword, and Taryn saw a vision." "Taryn?" Sable interjected and smiled again. "Pretty name. Is she pretty, Blue?" He ignored her. Taryn wasn't pretty. She was beautiful. "The dragon will battle us in the elf kingdom," he continued in a gruff tone, blanking the way Sable's smile widened, a knowing edge to her expression. He was growing tired of being teased by everyone. His relationship with Taryn was none of their business. "Us?" Thorn growled, but Blue could see he was secretly relishing the thought of going to war again. He nodded. "The fastest route for the dragon is through your realm, followed by the first or second. I have sent men to those realms to warn them to evacuate villages in the possible path of the dragon, or shore them up with more warriors. But I recommend the former. The sword this dragon wields is powerful." "I have heard the legends," Thorn said, his deep voice little more than a rumble as his rough features turned pensive. He rubbed his right thumb across his lower lip and frowned. "I will evacuate the villages along the border with the dragon realm, and send a legion of my warriors there." His red eyes flicked up to meet Blue's, a touch of warning in his narrowed gaze. "I must go and see to it." The demon male meant to leave him alone with his mate, but he didn't have to worry. He had no intention of delaying his return to the elf kingdom. The damned pool was probably close to overflowing now, and he couldn't stay away from Taryn any longer. The ache behind his breast had grown too fierce, a mad throb that demanded he return to his female and make sure that she was safe, and then kiss her until she was breathless but panting for more. Blue nodded as Thorn passed him, bent his head to Sable, and willed his portal to open and whisk him back to his waiting mate. Sable stopped him by speaking. "You look happy, and I've never seen you happy before." He paused, frowned, and then realized that it was true. Blue smiled at her. "That would be because I have not been happy in a very long time, since I gave up on finding my mate." Her eyes widened, and he teleported before she could say anything, eager to return to that mate. Chapter 29. Taryn paced her quarters, bare feet silent on the dark stone floor. It was surprisingly warm beneath them, smooth and silken. She could almost see the appeal of living in such a place over a cave. Almost. She turned when she reached the wall and the low cabinets that ran along it, and paced back towards the other end of the large room, her eyes fixed unseeingly on the 3 dark wardrobes that lined it to the left of the opening to the bathing room. The sound of water thundering into the pool had grown quieter during the time she had been pacing, a sign that it was getting full. Where was Blue? His scent lingered in the air, but it wasn't enough to soothe her. The castle was quiet around her, but she could sense people moving around below her, and could occasionally hear them outside. She had found the courage to open the twin tall glass doors to the right of the bed early into her wait, and had been pleasantly surprised to find a balcony outside them that ran along the length of the room. The view from it was stunning. She had never seen anything so beautiful. It had held her transfixed for long minutes, in which her eyes had delighted in watching the colors of the rolling landscape that stretched into the distance to meet with great cragged black mountains change as the light of the elf kingdom waned. The sky had changed color, becoming a fiery glow. Was that what a sunset in the mortal world would look like? She had heard tales from Loki about the mortal realm, passed down to him from his parents before he had lost them in the Dragon Wars. But she hadn't been able to imagine anything as beautiful as what she had seen from the balcony of her room. She could have passed the entire wait for Blue on that balcony, but a combination of fearing the pool would overflow, getting her into trouble with the elves, and the barked orders of a troop of soldiers in the courtyard below had driven her back inside. None of the soldiers marching around the quieter side of the castle grounds her balcony overlooked had noticed her, but she had promised Blue she would remain safe inside, and the thought that they might see her and report to him that she had been outside didn't sit well with her. She had seen her elf male angry, and she didn't want to be the one on the receiving end of it. Gods, what had he done to her? She couldn't believe the effect he had on her, how fiercely she needed him and desired to please him. No other male had affected her this way, and she knew deep in her heart that it had nothing to do with the fact that he was her fated one. It had everything to do with her growing feelings for him. Taryn tried to push him out of her thoughts, but the sound of running water kept him firmly in her mind. He had promised to return before the pool was full. She diverted course and checked on it, frowned when she saw that the level of the water was only inches from the brim of the low wall surrounding the deep rectangular pool now. He wasn't going to make it. She clenched her fists and then flexed her fingers, splaying them wide open, before curling them back into fists again. Gods, she needed him back with her. Thinking about his offer had stirred her hunger, the need of him that seemed impossible to satisfy. She growled, the sound vibrating up her throat, and paced the bathing room instead. She caught her reflection in the mirrors above the basins to her left and frowned. Her eyes glowed brightly, on fire with her hunger. She needed Blue. That need pounded in her blood, drumming in her veins, a fast rhythm that had her breathing accelerated as she studied her reflection. She skimmed her hands down her dirty white corset, over her curves and up to her breasts, cupping them before caressing up her chest to her hair. She tangled her hands in it and lifted it away from her throat, tipped her head to one side. Would Blue like to see her neck? Would it drive him mad as he drove her crazy with need? She wanted to push him to his limit. She wanted him to desire her as fiercely as she desired him. She searched the room, speeding from the wardrobes to the drawers in the cabinets on the opposite side of the room. There were items in both. She picked a beautiful dress similar to the one the prince's mate had worn, but this one was cream. Taryn held it up and paused. What was she doing? She had never dressed to impress any male before. Dragon males cared little about fashion. If a female wanted them, they were happy to service her needs. Even dragon females rarely wore more than leather trousers. She had always chosen to cover her top half, too. Perhaps she was more different to the females of her species than she had realized. She had never indulged in the free sex willingly offered by the males of her kind whenever a female was needing, had never even considered approaching a male in such a manner when she had felt an urge to mate. The dragons of her village had always whispered about her, the females wondering whether something was wrong with her because she didn't pursue the males as they did, showed none of the passionate drive to mate that they had. They had started talking about her more when she had matured, and had started to wear a corset to cover her breasts. Now she was standing in an elf castle, staring at a dress, considering wearing it in order to seduce a male. The females of her species viewed the correct attire for seduction as nothing. If they desired the attention and cock of a male, they stripped bare and went to them. They definitely didn't cover themselves up even more, and donning a dress was doing exactly that. Taryn eyed it, put her left hand behind the layers of sheer fabric and lifted it, letting the soft material run over her palm. It was beautiful, though. When Blue had changed before leaving for the demon realms, he had put on more clothing, and part of her had felt that he had done it to attract her eye. He had been making himself more appealing, more alluring, by dressing in such striking attire. Gods, the way it had hugged his figure. She had wanted to peel it off him slowly. Had been thinking about doing such a thing the entire time he had been gone. The need was so fierce now that she ached just thinking about unbuttoning the tunic and slowly parting it to reveal his powerful, honed body. She bit her lip and squeezed her thighs together when the ache reached there, making her damp with need. She wanted such power over her male. She wanted to dress in a way that would have him aching for her, mad with the need to have her, to strip her slowly and savor revealing her to his eyes. Taryn turned, tossed the dress on the bed, and stripped off. She kicked her corset and trousers into the corner of the room with her boots, strode to the bed, and picked up the dress. She had never worn one before, but they couldn't be that difficult to master. She sifted through the layers of the skirt, grumbled a few choice curses beneath her breath when she couldn't find the damned center of them, and huffed. A different approach was needed. She spotted the lacing on the back of the dress, smiled. If she loosened it, she might be able to step into the dress and pull it up over her hips. She tugged on the bow at the top of the lacing, worked her fingers down the crisscross of the ribbons, and opened the dress up. She pulled it on the floor, stepped into it, grabbed the two sides of the corset and pulled it up, wriggled when it got stuck on her hips, sighed when it finally hit her waist and easily came up to her breasts. Getting the lacing done back up was another fight. She turned in circles as she reached over her back, snagging the first lace easily but struggling with the second. Gods! She growled and stretched harder, grimacing as her shoulder hurt. Stupid dress. She finally caught the second lace, tugged them both up, and pulled a face when she reached a point where she could barely breathe. She padded into the bathing room and looked at her reflection. She did look stunning, though. The cream material hugged her torso, accentuating her waist and her breasts. She smiled wickedly and tied the bow, and then hurried back to the wardrobes. A flicker of disappointment went through her. There wasn't a corset to go with the dress. She had hoped to find one similar to that which the prince's mate had worn. It had looked uncomfortable, but it had been pretty. She could almost feel her eyes sparkling. Her fingers itched, and she flexed them as she thought about the corset. It had glittered, silver, shiny. She swayed on the spot and then snapped herself back to the room. Now wasn't the time to get lost in thinking about treasure. She moved to the drawers in the cabinets across the room and rifled through the one that had contained many different trinkets, all of them treasure. Gods, she had to hide them somewhere. They weren't safe where they were. She growled as she lifted the skirt of her dress and bundled everything into it, every shiny object in every drawer. Her skirt was heavy by the time she had found all of them. She scanned the room, swinging around in a circle, her heart pounding rapidly as she searched for a safe place to stow her prizes. A pained snarl escaped her. Nowhere was safe in this damned room. This was why caves were better. Caves had secret tunnels, hidden chambers ideal for storing treasure and keeping it safe. Her eyes leaped to the bed and dropped to the floor beneath it. She would have to sleep on the bed. If she placed her treasure beneath it, it would be safe there. No one would dare try to take it from her if she guarded it so closely. She scurried to the bed, tossed the covers up onto the mattress on the left side, away from the doors onto the balcony, and began unloading her hoard. She set aside a piece for her hair, a beautiful silver clasp with sparkling amethysts, and pushed the rest under the wooden frame of the double bed. Settling back on her heels, she frowned at the small pile. It was still too obvious. She scanned the room again and grinned when she spotted her boots. Taryn sprinted to them, gathering them and her trousers and corset, and hurried back to her treasure. She shoveled the trinkets into her boots, stuffed her trousers and corset into the end of them, and tucked them back under the bed on their sides. There, as safe as she could get it for now. Satisfied at last, she rose onto her feet, drew the dark purple covers down over the side of the bed, and smoothed them so none would suspect they hid anything. She took the clasp from the dark stone floor and went into the bathing room. The pool was close to overflowing now. Taryn twirled her hair up and pinned it at the back of her head. Strands fell down, but she didn't care. She ran her hands over her exposed neck. The marks Blue had placed on her throat were paler now, healing well. She shivered when her fingertips brushed them, a hit of pleasure rolling down her spine. It was so wrong that it had felt so good when he had been biting her, even when she had been afraid he would kill her. And the way he had licked her throat afterwards? The shiver became a burn that had her squeezing her thighs together again. The sound of water stopped. She whirled to face the pool, her eyes widening when she saw that the level had reached the spout, and rushed to the sluice that Blue had opened. She twisted the thick metal ring and shoved down, jamming it shut. A hot shiver coursed through her, setting her aflame. She lifted her head and stared across the pool to the other end, to Blue where he stood with his eyes on her, his chest heaving with each hard breath he drew. Those striking eyes almost glowed in the low warm light of the chandelier above the pool, and the way his pointed ears flared back, the tips growing longer, had all of the heat rushing through her heading south to coil in her belly. His gaze narrowed as she slowly stood, raked over her and grew heated, dark with the passion and hunger that flowed through their link. Gods, when she had dressed to seduce him, she hadn't realized just how deeply his reaction would affect her. She felt beautiful, desired, needed. That need was a powerful force, one that rocked her as he strode towards her, a male on the prowl and one who was going to take what he wanted from her. She trembled, all of her strength stripped from her again as she waited for him, eager to feel his hands on her, desperate for another taste of him. He snarled, looked her over again, and caught her cheeks the moment he was within reach and pulled her up to him for a hard kiss. His tongue delved between her lips as he slanted his head, inhaled hard as if the kiss had sent the same bolt of hot lightning through him as it had through her. She swallowed his throaty moan and clutched his shoulders, digging her fingers into the fine material of his jacket as he possessed her mouth, claimed all of her with only a kiss. His hands dropped to her backside and he groaned as he palmed it, drew her closer and kissed her fiercely, his desperation sending a thrill through her. She hadn't been prepared for this. It was far more than she had expected. The ferocity of his need startled her, but as she leaned into him, seeking more from his kiss, it dawned on her that his passion and hunger only matched her own. The thought that she wasn't alone in her feelings gave her courage. She moved her hands across his chest, found the line of buttons down the center of his tunic, and began slipping them free of their holes. His kiss slowed, his ragged breathing filling her ears as he eased her back. Their mouths broke apart and he looked down, chest heaving as he watched her unbuttoning his jacket. His need poured through her, swirling together with her own sense of anticipation and eagerness. When she reached the last button, just below his navel, she lowered her gaze to his chest and slowly parted the two sides of his jacket. Her breath hitched in her throat as she caught her first glimpse of the compact muscles of his torso, and then shortened as she revealed more of him, slipping her hands beneath his jacket and brushing it aside by moving her hands over the delicious hard slabs of his pectorals. Blue half groaned, half growled. He trembled beneath her, and she had never felt so powerful. She had brought this warrior to his knees with only a touch. She smoothed her hands up his chest to his shoulders and slowly pushed the jacket off them. He shifted his arms back and it dropped to the floor behind him. Hungry eyes raked over her, making her shiver again, and he muttered something in his own tongue. She frowned at him, wanting to know what he had said in such a passion-drenched voice, but not expecting him to tell her. He had said much to her in that language, and she knew he did it because he wanted to keep those things secret from her, even though he couldn't stop himself from voicing them. What things didn't he want her to know? the same sort of thing she had thought were hidden back in the dungeon of Tenak's castle, when she hadn't realized the Fae's blood had given him the ability to hear her thoughts. "Gods, you are beautiful," he whispered earnestly in the dragon tongue, and her heart warmed, her belly fluttering in response to those low-spoken words and the fact he hadn't kept them secret from her. His violet eyes traveled down the line of her throat, darkening by degrees as his pupils dilated. The tip of his tongue swept across his lips, and hunger lit his eyes, a thirst that ran deeper than a need for blood. He needed her. She could feel it in him through their link, and it called to her dragon instincts, rousing a fierce demand that she satisfy her male. She stepped closer and leaned in to kiss his chest, at the same time as his left hand rose to her hair. It neared her silver clasp. Terran leaped back and snarled at him, flashing sharp teeth. He tensed, eyes shooting wide, the hunger in them replaced with shock that rippled through her. I did not—" She wasn't sure what to say. Instinct had stolen control of her, roaring that he meant to steal the clasp and forcing her to warn him away. She would have lashed out at him if she hadn't retained enough awareness of what she was doing to distance herself from him. Terran lifted a hand to the clasp, fingers shaking as she touched it, and a strange soothing warmth flowing through her when she felt it was still there, still in her possession. A wicked smile curled Blue's lips. "You can keep your treasure," he breathed in a sultry whisper, and slowly stepped towards her, closing the distance between them, his eyes holding hers the whole time. "But your throat is temptingly bare, and I am not sure I am strong enough to resist the need to bite you again. I do not want to hurt you, Terran." Her fingers shook for a different reason, the warmth that had been curling through her exploding into a wildfire that blazed in her blood and made her want to moan. Just the thought of him sinking his fangs back into her made her itch with a need to mark him too. A dangerous desire. Biting him would seal their bond, completing it and making them mated. She wasn't sure she was ready for that, and she felt certain that he wasn't. There was still so much to learn about each other, so much to overcome before they could think about forging a permanent bond between them. She wasn't going to rush into this, because the thought of allowing her instincts to mate to blind her, only to realize later that the one she had bound herself to didn't share her feelings, made her heart heavy. She refused to do anything until she was certain, until they were both certain. So biting was definitely off limits, because as much as she ached to feel his fangs in her flesh again, feel that intense connection between them blossoming once more, she couldn't risk the danger that in the heat of the moment she would bite him in return. She reached up and pulled the clasp from her hair, letting it tumble back down around her shoulders. The silver trinket was warm in her hand, and she stared down at it, mesmerized by how the jewels sparkled at her. Her feet carried her away from Blue, her instincts sweeping her along unaware of what she was doing. She crouched beside the bed, raised the covers, and carefully tucked her treasure into her boots, safe with the rest of her hoard. When she straightened and turned back to face the bathing room, Blue was standing in the grand archway, his right shoulder against the stone frame, his legs casually crossed at the ankle and his arms folded across his bare chest. His left eyebrow quirked. "What do you have there?" He jerked his chin towards the bed. She spread her arms out at her sides and growled. "Mine." He smiled again, and she realized what she had done, felt like a fool as he grinned, obviously amused by her behavior. "I am not interested in taking anything from you. Whatever you have, you can keep." He advanced on her, his smile slowly fading, an all too serious expression replacing it as his eyes held hers, bewitching her and pulling her under his seductive spell again. "I have the only treasure I need." She frowned. "You do? I would like to see this treasure." She would like to make it hers. He smiled, but this time it was wicked, heating her to her core as he held his hand out to her. "Come with me, then." Chapter 30. Blue held his hand out to her, and Taryn eagerly slipped hers into it, excitement bubbling up and tugging at her lips. There was a bounce in her step as he turned away from her, but it faded as he led her into the bathroom. She frowned and scanned the room. There were no hidden compartments or anywhere he could hide treasure. Was he toying with her to make her return to the pool with him? The thought that he might be made her want to growl at his bare back. Only that growl died on her lips as she watched his muscles shift in a sinful symphony with each step he took. Gods! He had called her beautiful, but he was the beautiful one. She ran her eyes down the line of his spine to the twin dimples above his backside and bit back a moan. She wanted to tongue those dips while he laid on his front on the bed, and she would palm the firm globes of his backside at the same time, finally getting her hands on them. She was so deep in her wicked thoughts that she hadn't realized they had stopped moving until he spoke. "Have I lost you again?" She blinked herself back to him and found herself staring into the mirror above the basin. He stood behind her, his hands on her bare shoulders, his cheek close to the right side of her head, and his eyes locked with hers in their reflection. "Where is your treasure?" she whispered, still eager to see it. He lowered his lips to her ear. "You are looking at it." She frowned, and all of her excitement deflated, her shoulders sagging beneath his grip as she huffed, "The mirror is nothing special. It is not a treasure." He smiled, stealing her breath. "It is not the mirror, but what it contains." That made no sense. "It is a mirror. It contains nothing. Nothing but a reflection of this room, anyway. You and I." He muttered something in the elf tongue, closed his eyes, and sighed. His frustration rolled through her. She pouted and stared at the mirror, trying to see what he called a treasure. There was nothing special about it, and it only showed him where he stood behind her. Oh. Her eyes widened. Her. Was he calling her his treasure? Her heart skipped a beat. Blue's eyes slowly opened, fixed on hers in the mirror again, and he drew her hair away from the right side of her throat and pressed a tender kiss to it. Her blood heated. She wanted him to tell her that she was the treasure he had spoken of, but the frustration that had gone through him had been replaced with nerves, and she didn't want to push him. Not when his violet eyes gave her the answer to that question, as he brushed his lips over her throat, holding her gaze in their reflection. She was. She was his treasure, and he wanted to possess her. The heat each sweep of his mouth over her flesh caused slowly spread through her, until she couldn't stop herself from leaning her head to her left and moaning. He lightly bit with blunt teeth, teasing her with a brief flash of pain, a touch of pleasure that only roused a need for more. Gods, she wanted him to bite her. She trembled as he slid his hands around her waist, brought them up to cup her breasts, hitching some of the layers of her cream dress up with them. He groaned against her throat and palmed her breasts, his bare torso pressing against her back. She lifted her right hand, skimmed it over his shoulder, and curled it around the nape of his neck, sifting her fingers through his silky blue-black hair as she savored the feel of his lips on her skin, and how erotic watching them in the mirror made everything. "You look too damn good in this dress." He pressed kisses across her shoulder as he looked at her reflection, his eyes dark with the need she sensed in him. He rolled his hips, nudging the hard length in his trousers against her backside. "I did not want to take it off you." Gods. She throbbed between her thighs, core clenching at the thought of him being inside her while she stood before the mirror. He nibbled her shoulder and then her neck, groaning low in his throat, as if he could hear her thoughts and approved of them. His thumbs caught the top of her corset across her breasts, and he inched it down, his eyes hot on her as he revealed her nipples. They pebbled the instant the cooler air hit them, and a moan left her lips, her eyes slipping shut as a shiver cascaded across her skin. Blue mouthed her neck, licked it, and pressed his tongue in hard before softening his touch again, gently kissing upwards towards her ear. He sucked the lobe into his mouth and thumbed her nipples, his breath hot on her ear. She moaned as he rocked against her, grinding his cock between her buttocks. finding it hard to focus when every strum of her nipples sent sparks skittering across her skin, and his mouth on her and the feel of him behind her was sending fire to her belly. She arched back against him and he groaned, bit her earlobe and caught her left hip. He held her in place, his fingertips pressing into the flesh through her skirt, and thrust against her, a frown darkening on his face. His nostrils flared and he narrowed his gaze on hers in the mirror, ground harder against her backside until a moan escaped her and she tipped her head back, resting it on his shoulder. God, she needed more. The hand against her hip traveled lower, hastily pulled her skirts up and found its way inside. She groaned in time with him when he slipped his hand between her thighs, couldn't stop herself from parting for him, spreading her legs as much as she could while still standing. His guttural growl as he speared her plush lips with his fingers and caressed her nub sent a fierce shiver through her, a hunger to hear him snarl again. There had been need in his growl, approval and male satisfaction, all rolled together into a sound that brought her to life, made her ache to feel him inside her. "You're so wet," he whispered into her ear, and she blushed, suddenly unsure of herself. Was that wrong? He caught her gaze in the mirror and smiled wickedly as he nibbled her earlobe. "I love it. It tells me how much you need me." Her knees almost buckled. His right hand caught her hip and steadied her. He growled into her ear, his face dark with a hungry, possessive look that only sent her arousal soaring higher until she could scarcely breathe. "My female needs," he snarled in a low, deep voice, one that sent a tremor through her and had her on the verge of begging him to do something about it. She didn't need to ask. He pulled at her skirts, raising them up to her waist, and she gasped as cold air hit her backside and thighs, causing an eruption of goose flesh. He chased away the chill by planting his hands on her bottom and palming it, his low moans echoing through her as she absorbed the sight of him in the mirror. She had never seen him looking so hungry, so fierce. She wriggled as he released her, his eyes dropping from hers, focused on his work, and she heard him unlacing his trousers. Her breathing grew ragged, heart thundering, need swirling with anticipation to crank her tight and make it impossible to keep still. When his hands claimed her hips again, what felt like an eternity later, but had probably been no more than a few seconds, she moaned and shivered, raised her backside to meet his touch. He groaned and rubbed her bottom, and then drew her hips back, lifting them until she was tiptoeing and had to clutch the edge of the vanity in front of her to stop herself from falling forwards. Blue's dark gaze met hers in the mirror again, locked with it and held it fast. His eyes narrowed, lids dropping to shutter his beautiful irises for a moment, as he nudged the head of his cock against her. She lifted her hips higher, desperate to feel him inside her again, his long, thick length filling and stretching her. He tortured her, though, rubbing the blunt, broad head along her wet cleft to stroke her clit, sending 1,000 fiery sparks shooting down her thighs and up her belly. She couldn't bite back the moan as she throbbed, each small contraction making what he was doing feel even more incredible. He groaned and the head of his cock slid back, probed her entrance and stole her breath. She wanted to press back onto it but gripped the vanity instead, resisting the temptation. He slowly fed his erection into her, maddening her with a hunger to make him thrust deep and fast, spearing her to the very depth of her core. His right hand tightened on her hip, as if he had sensed her need to push back, and held her firm. She moaned in unison with him as he drove forwards, pushing the head of his cock into her. Satisfaction flowed through her as he sank deeper, bliss following in its wake. She closed her eyes and then opened them again, wanting to stare into his and see the pleasure he felt as he joined them. His violet eyes grew darker but brighter at the same time, and the pointed tips of his ears flattened against his wild blue-black hair. He groaned, a breathless one that thrilled her, as he pushed deeper and claimed both of her hips with his hands. Short nails dug into her flesh, and he plunged forwards, until his thighs brushed the backs of hers and his cock was seated to the hilt inside her. His gaze held hers in the mirror, possessing her soul as fiercely as he now possessed her body. She stared back at him, Lost in the hunger and need his showed to her, the wildness that was fast coming to life inside her, too, roused by the way he was looking at her and the sight of them in the mirror. Her breasts spilled from her corset, dusky nipples taut with need. She waited for him to move, to withdraw and thrust back in, beginning their steady climb towards their release. He didn't. He swept one hand forwards, delved it between her thighs, and fondled her bundle of nerves. She moaned and writhed, flexed around his rock-hard length as pleasure spilled through her. His answering groan made another leave her lips, her arousal soaring to the point where control slipped beyond her grasp as he teased her nub, flicking and squeezing it, rubbing it with the flats of his fingers, all the while keeping his cock lodged inside her. Gods! He lowered his mouth, brushed it across her shoulder, licked and nipped in a rough way that told her that she wasn't the only one losing control, being overwhelmed by her need and desire. You feel so fucking good. You feel so fucking good, too, she whispered back at him, and he grinned at her. She flexed her body around his cock, ripping the smile from his face and tearing a grunt from him that sounded animalistic, wild. He sneered, lips peeling back to flash his fangs at her in a way that sent a wicked thrill through her, and clutched her hip with his other hand, withdrew until his cock almost slipped free of her before driving forwards, sending her rocking towards the mirror. She couldn't contain the moan that left her lips, or stop herself from bracing herself against the slab of dark stone beneath the basin and pushing back against him, goading him into doing it again. He refused, stopped, and gave her pleasure another way, sliding his fingers down to where he entered her and bringing them back up to tease her nub. She moaned and lost herself in the sparks of pleasure that exploded with each expert swirl of his fingers, breathing hard as awareness of everything around her faded until all she knew was the bliss of his touch and the surging wave of release building inside her. Blue skimmed his right hand up her side, cupped her breast, and teased her right nipple as he kissed her throat. His eyes remained locked on hers the entire time, and she quivered as she watched him, felt him kissing and touching her, saw it happening in the mirror, too. She tensed, flexed around him, her face screwing up as the wave inside her built and she reached the crest, on the verge of crashing into her climax. He chose that moment to withdraw and thrust back into her. Taryn cried out her climax, 1,000 glittering lights exploding across her eyes, as her entire body quaked with release, flashed hot and cold at the same time. Blue growled and didn't give her a chance to catch her breath. His right hand squeezed her breast, his left one claimed her hip, and he plunged into her. Hard and fast strokes that had her surging through the haze of one orgasm and barreling towards her next with him. He bit down on her shoulder, his fierce need flowing through her, cranking hers higher. She rocked against him, moaned with each deep plunge of his cock into her core as it still trembled with her release. He released her shoulder and kissed up her neck, nibbled her lobe and breathed heavily into her ear as he took her, stroking her with every inch of his long, hard length. His eyes continued to hold hers in the mirror as he raised his left hand from her hip and caught her jaw in it. He tilted her head to her left, held it there as his right hand lowered to clutch her hip, to hold her steady as he drove into her with fierce possessive thrusts that left her breathless. She moaned as the pressure built in her belly again, stoked by the long plunges of his cock into her core and the way he held her at his mercy, her throat bared to him. He lowered his head and kissed her neck, scraped fangs over it and sent a wave of tingles through her, fire that only made her burn hotter for him. Her breasts bounced with each hard stroke of his length, the pressure building higher as she watched them in the mirror, watched him devouring her neck as he watched her. Dear gods! He growled against her skin, a low rumbling snarl, and angled his hips, lowering them. She gasped as he sank deeper into her, striking the depth of her core with each long thrust, each wild union of their bodies. His answering moan relayed the pleasure that flooded their link, telling her how close he was, that he balanced on the precipice just as she did. He nicked her throat with his left fang, wrapped his lips around it, and suckled. Stars detonated across her eyes again, her entire body tensing and jerking as release exploded through her, stealing her breath and making her heart stutter in her chest. Blue's cock pulsed inside her, the throbbing and the feel of his hot seed jetting into her with each rough thrust of his hips, sending aftershocks through her, heightening her pleasure as it mingled with his. He groaned and shuddered, his mouth still latched onto her neck, breath coming as hard and fast as her own was as she tried to bring herself down again. She had never soared so high, had never felt such a thrill, such intense, mind-blowing pleasure. It was better than flying. He held her for long minutes, still clutching her tightly. Wetness trickled down her inner thighs as she caught her breath, body numbed from 2 releases, and she felt sure that if she let go of the vanity, she would fall in a boneless heap on the floor. Her senses slowly pieced back together, and she managed a frown when she realized Blue had slipped free of her and was undoing her dress. She questioned him silently in the mirror, and he smiled, his rich purple eyes hazy with satisfaction that sent a ripple of pride through her. She had done that to him. "You really need a bath now," he murmured and dropped a kiss on her shoulder. A sparkle lit his eyes as they met hers in the mirror, and he tugged her dress down, revealing her bare body to him. She supposed he had promised to bathe with her. She slowly peeled her hands off the vanity, was pleasantly surprised when she didn't collapse, and turned to face him. Gods, he was naked. As she ran her eyes down the length of him, the embers of her desire sparked back to life, and the way his soft length twitched back to semi-hard said she wasn't the only one thinking naughty things. Blue scooped her up into his arms, and she looped hers around his neck, toyed with the longer strands of his hair as he carried her towards the pool. His wicked smile as he gazed down at her filled her mind with one delicious thought, as if he had projected his into her head. They were going to do a lot more than washing each other's backs in that pool. Chapter 31. Blue wasn't sure he knew the meaning of concentrate anymore. He paced the grand war room of the elf castle, the light filtering in through the 5 tall arched windows to his left, flickering over him whenever he emerged from the shadows of the columns that stretched between them to support the vaulted ceiling. 6 windows lined the wall off to his right across the room, too, and the curved wall at the end of the room ahead of him, allowing so much light in that the pale gray stone looked white. His gaze flicked across to his right as he reached the double doors that led onto a small balcony and turned, settling briefly on Taryn where she stood staring at the huge model of hell, her beautiful eyes studying the lands near the devil's realm. Her thoughts were on her brother again. He could see it in the worry lines between her fine eyebrows and feel it in the link they shared. Lauren stood on the opposite side of the massive table, dressed in the black formal attire of embroidered knee-length tunic, tight trousers, and polished boots suited to the occasion. Blue glanced down at himself, taking in similar clothing before marching onwards. Everyone was late. They hadn't received word back from the messengers sent to the 1st, 2nd, or 3rd demon realms to request the presence of the kings. What if something had happened in those realms? What if the kings had fallen, torn from their thrones by Tenak? It worried him, but it wasn't the reason he found concentration an elusive thing. So much so that Lauren had ordered him away from the map, since he had been more than useless, unable to assist his prince in formulating a plan. Taryn was doing a better job than he had been. He flicked another glance at her. How the hell could she focus when he couldn't string 2 thoughts together without his mind leaping to ones about her? There is a possibility Tenak might have completely skirted the demon realms and traveled up this corridor. She ran a finger up the map, along a ridge of mountains, leaning forwards to reach further. Gods, he imagined her fingers running over the peaks and valleys of his torso like that, a light maddening touch that would only serve to fuel the fierce craving he had for her. Her violet leather-clad thighs pressed against the edge of the map, the front of her white corset touching the mountains of the devil's realm, and her violet-to-white hair swung away from her shoulders, falling like a veil to hide her face from him. She brought her right hand up and tucked her hair behind her ear, as if she knew he needed to do such a thing, ached to see her face again. It is the easiest route to the elf kingdom, but it would mean traveling through the free realm and would bring him into the kingdom at the furthest point from your castle. Her soft voice was music in the room, a light and airy sound that soothed him but clawed at his insides. Fuck, he had missed the sound of her voice. He had missed the sight of her, the feel of her near him, the scent of her, everything about her. 2 whole days caught up in arranging squad movements, planning routes across the elf kingdom, and holding meetings with his senior officers had pulled him away from her. But it hadn't pulled his mind away from thoughts about the time he had spent with her after returning from the Third Realm. She had looked so beautiful in the dress that he hadn't been able to keep his hands off her. Now he couldn't keep his eyes off her. He needed her, and he could feel that she needed him too. It was there in their link and in her eyes whenever she risked a glance at him. Every time their eyes met, the entire room fell away, everyone but her disappearing, and all he could think about was crossing the room to her, pulling her into his arms and kissing her. How the fuck had he convinced himself that his being away from her, caught up in his work, was a good thing, giving himself some much-needed space to think and time to pull himself together, to stop his mind from spinning whenever they were near each other? He found himself staring at her as he paced, unable to drag his eyes away from her. That time apart hadn't helped him at all. It hadn't allowed him to act more professional, treating her as a guest of the castle and an ally in the coming war. It hadn't dampened his feelings for her or weakened them at all. It had done the damned opposite. Their time apart had increased his need of her, strengthened his feelings for her. He had spent 2 damn days stuck in his offices in the garrison pining for her. Fucking pining. He had spent every damned night standing in his room, staring at the wall that divided them and aching to tear it down. Only the fact that she had felt still on his senses had kept him from barging into her room. He hadn't wanted to disturb his little dragon. She needed her rest. Still needed it if the dark circles beneath her eyes were anything to go by. Were thoughts of her brother and what was coming keeping her awake? Gods, he wanted to cross the room to her, draw her into his arms and tell her that it would all work out in the end, that everything she feared would never come to pass, and he would protect her. It would be a lie, though. Her biggest fear was something that had to happen in order to end the threat to his kingdom and the other realms of hell. Her brother had to die, even if they managed to get the sword back. Tenak would always be a threat, and his dragon instincts wouldn't allow him to let go of his treasure. Taryn's behavior in her room had made Blue see that. If they took the sword from him, Tenak would keep coming at the elf kingdom until he had razed it to the ground, and the blade was his again. Even capturing him and placing shackles on him that could inhibit his ability to shift and stop his magic wouldn't be enough. Eventually, he would gain his freedom and all of hell would pay for it. Taryn glanced at him again, sending a hot shiver through him that stirred his need to pull her into his arms, growl mine, and then kiss her breathless so she knew it. Fuck. He scrubbed a hand over his hair, tousling the longer lengths, and ran it around the back of his neck. He hadn't lied when he had said that she was his treasure, and the way her eyes sparkled whenever she looked at him, that same light that had shone in them when she had protected her treasure she had discovered in her room, said that she felt the same way about him. He smiled at that, and how she had hoarded the knickknacks she had found. Mere trinkets, nothing fine among them. Blue frowned as he grew aware of another's eyes on him and looked across at Lauren, finding his prince watching him with a touch of curiosity mixed with satisfaction in his expression. He raised an eyebrow at that, and how Lauren leaned to his right and pressed a kiss to Olivia's shoulder where she stood beside him, talking to him about something. Olivia lifted her dark eyes away from the map, settled them on Lauren, and smiled. When she leaned over for a proper kiss, Blue looked away. His gaze snagged on Taryn. She walked away from the map, drifting towards the tall doors on his side of the room beside the windows. A messenger entered the room. An unmated male. Blue closed the distance between him and his little dragon, but the threat the unmated male posed to his position as her mate wasn't the reason he wanted to be closer to her again. He needed her near him. He felt empty when she was so far away from him. It was only a small distance, a few meters at most, but fuck, it felt like a league to him. Lauren looked at him again as he spoke with the messenger, and this time his prince looked concerned. His violet gaze shifted from Blue to Taryn, where she stood near the doors onto the balcony and back again before returning to the messenger. The male saluted and left the room. "The first realm will arrive soon, and our other guests are en route. Perhaps we should take a break until they arrive, and we can begin our meeting in earnest." Lauren was meddling again. Blue didn't need to catch his pointed look at Taryn's back to know it, nor the not-so-subtle jerk of his chin in her direction as she stepped out onto the balcony. Blue glared at him and followed her. He didn't need his prince telling him to go after her. It wasn't as if he could keep away from her, would follow her to the ends of hell just to be near her. How had he managed to stay away from her for so long? He found Taryn on the balcony, her hands braced on the pale stone balustrade, eyes scanning the vast panorama. The entire elf kingdom stretched before them, green hills rolling into the distance where they met mountains. A glittering blue river snaked between them. Her head tilted downwards, and he looked there as he came up beside her, watching the troops moving around the orchard. Dacian stormed along one of the pale gray paths that led away from the central portal, heading towards the garrison. Blue's right eyebrow arched when the portal flared and Finn's sister strode out of it, looked around, spotted Dacian, and went after him. Interesting. "It is beautiful," Taryn whispered in the dragon tongue, and Blue tore his focus away from Dacian, returning it to her. He looked out at the view she admired, leaned on his elbows on the railing, and frowned. "I prefer the one from my balcony at the rear of the castle." He looked to his right at Taryn. "It is the same as yours, since our rooms are adjoining." "I know. I can feel you there. Close to me, but so far away." She smiled, but there was sorrow in it, hurt that clawed at him, sinking talons deep into his heart. Blue cast his gaze down at the courtyard and picked at the lichens on the stone with his right hand. "I'm sorry. I was busy, and whenever I finished with my work it was late, and I feared I would wake you if I came to you." Her eyes didn't leave the horizon, and her hurt didn't lessen, and he wanted to soothe it away. He just wasn't sure how. "I wanted you to come to me," she whispered. "I do not like it here." He frowned and looked across at her. "You are safe here, Taryn." Her eyes closed. "Am I?" Blue pushed up, resting his palms against the balustrade, and growled. "Has anyone made you feel threatened?" She shook her head. "Of course not. Because—" She opened her eyes, fixing them straight on him, and the coldness in them froze his blood in his veins and chilled his heart. "Because I cannot leave my room without you. I am locked in there, in a gilded cage, in a Blue caught her wrist. Her dull eyes dropped to it, brightened again, and then sharpened, and she yanked her arm free of his grip. Wrong move on his part, one he should have known would upset her. She was feeling confined again, a captive, and he had only worsened that feeling by seizing her so tightly. Gods, he needed to learn the right ways to handle his little dragon. It was hard when his instincts said to hold her when she was hurting, though, to touch her to bring her back to him and shatter the hold of her memories. "I need to fly," she whispered, and her hands shook, her breath coming fast, causing her chest to heave against the tight confines of her white leather corset. "I need to fly." Blue hunkered down, lowered his head to her height, and carefully reached for her. He placed his hands under hers, not taking hold of them, just allowing her palms to rest against his. Her pain flowed through him, rife with fear and desperation. It wasn't growing weaker, it was growing stronger. "I'm sorry. I should have considered how you would feel. I should have known, and I should have taken you with me. Although I am not sure how much you would have enjoyed being shut in my office with me for hours on end." He risked curling his fingers over to press against hers, and she looked down at their joined hands, her eyebrows rising high on her forehead, a faraway look shining in her striking eyes. He was losing her. He could almost feel her slipping away. "I'm sorry. It is not a cage, Taryn. I was only trying to protect you." "I know," she murmured, distant and quiet. "I tried to bear it, but I need air."
I need to fly."
"I will take you out when the meeting ends. I will take you somewhere far away where you can feel free." He looked back inside at Lauren, found his prince still watching him, and then looked in the other direction towards the hills and the river. It was only a short distance from the castle, and Lauren would be able to keep an eye on their guest, reassured that they would return and Blue hadn't gone rogue with her or lost control of her. He caught hold of her hands and willed his portal. Green-purple light chased down his arms and up hers. She gasped and darkness swirled around them. When it receded, they were standing in the long grass by a bend in the river. Her violet to white eyes widened, and she looked around them, drawing back and slipping free of his right hand. He kept his left hand on hers, twisted it to slip his fingers between hers, and watched her as she took it all in. The fingers of her left hand brushed over the tips of the swaying grass that reached past her knees. A smile played on her lips. "You cannot fly. Promise me that, Taryn. I will take you somewhere to fly soon." She looked across at him and nodded. Blue led her down the slope to the water, where the grass was shorter, and released her. He sat on the bank of the river, leaned back, and propped himself up on his elbows. Taryn looked down at him and then slowly turned around, her eyes scanning everything, bright and wide as she took it all in.
"It is even more beautiful from down here."
Her smile blew him away. He had never seen her so happy. "I agree. The view is even more beautiful from down here." He didn't take his eyes off her, and she looked at him. Her eyes widened a little further, and a blush climbed her cheeks when she caught the meaning behind his words. She was more beautiful. She turned her back on him, crouched, and reached out to touch the water. Her hand shot back to her before it hit the surface, and she looked over her shoulder at him.
"Will it hurt me?"
Blue laughed. "No, of course not. It is only water." She frowned at him.
"There is a substance like it in the dragon realms and some of the demon ones that is poisonous."
"I suppose that is true, but this is only water. Nothing here will hurt you." She muttered as she turned away from him again.
"Nothing but the elves."
He sighed. "I swear they will not touch you. Is my word not enough?" Her head dipped, and she idly ran her fingers through the crystal-clear water, her sorrow flowing through him.
"It is. I am sorry."
"You do not need to apologize to me, Taryn." He sat up, bent his knees, and rested his forearms on them. "I know my kin have not treated you well. I have not treated you well. I have given you no reason to trust me." He lowered his right hand, plucked a blade of grass, and twirled it in his fingers, his eyes on it. Hers roamed to him, heating his skin, but he kept his locked on the grass as it spun, a green blur against the pale blue of the water.
"I do trust you, Blue,"
she whispered, and he smiled as those words warmed him, chasing away the rising hurt before it could seize hold of him. She sighed, the sound soft and melodic, and kneeled beside the river. The hurt he had feared would take hold of him gripped her instead, and he rose onto his feet, walked over to her, and sat opposite her. "You think of your brother," he said, and she nodded. He reached out and caught hold of her right hand, drawing it away from her purple leathers, and brushed his thumb over the back of it. "I know this is hard for you, Taryn." She lowered her head and let her left hand drift back down to the water, stared at it as the river rushed between her fingers, glittering in the light.
"You left me alone, and all I could think about was my brother, and everything we have shared. How he changed, how it drove us apart. And now I must end it all. I must end."
Blue leaned over and pressed the fingers of his free hand to her lips to silence her, because he couldn't bear the pain. He couldn't allow her to keep hurting herself. She lifted her eyes to him, and the tears that trembled on her lashes tore at his heart. "I swear," he husked, voice thick, clogged with the emotions she stirred in him, the need, the love, and the desperate desire to make her happy again. "If my presence keeps those dark thoughts at bay, then you will not be able to get rid of me. I will stick to you like glue."
Glue?
Her eyebrows pinched together.
What is glue?
He swept his thumb over the back of her hand. It is a product that mortals use to fuse two items together. A sticky substance. I hear it is sometimes made from animal bones. The pain in her eyes faded, curiosity rising to replace it.
You know the mortal realm well?
He nodded. She leaned closer.
Will you tell me about it? I cannot go there, but I would like to know it.
Her and all dragons. They were all fixated on learning about it, since they had been banished from that realm, cursed to have their powers stripped from them the moment they entered it, and to die if they lingered there. I will tell you everything about it, whatever you want to know. Her smile could have illuminated all of hell. Gods, if he had known the mortal realm was the way to her heart, he would have been telling her everything about it since the moment she had driven back the darkness in him in that cell in Tenak's castle. She opened her mouth to speak. Someone appeared beside him, and she was behind him in an instant, her hands clutching his shoulders and a low snarl escaping her. Lauren arched an eyebrow at her and then flicked Blue a very emotionless look that he presumed was meant to conceal the myriad of feelings that were shining in his eyes. His prince had always been rather poor at hiding his emotions. Our allies have arrived, Lauren said, deep voice smooth and calm, but still not hiding his amusement or his twisted sense of satisfaction. He was gloating. Blue scowled at him. So what if he had found his mate and it was obvious he had feelings for her? He was still behaving in a more sane and reasonable manner than Lauren had when he had met Olivia, or any of the damned males he knew had acted when they had met their fated females. Although, using his incomplete bond as an excuse to punch his meddling prince in his perfect face was starting to look appealing. Lauren frowned back at him, his acute senses clearly warning him of the imminent threat. His prince held his hand out to Taryn. Would you like me to teleport you back to the war room? Blue shot to his feet and growled at Lauren. There was little point in concealing his feelings when Lauren knew he felt something for Taryn. Hands off! He smacked his left one against the one Lauren offered to Taryn, knocking it away. I will escort Taryn back. Lauren smiled wickedly. Very well, but I do have one request. You laid a hand on me, and I am required to report such behavior to the council so you may be punished. Damn. His prince was up to something. He had provoked him on purpose in order to get something he wanted in exchange for not snitching on him to the council. Blue had the sinking feeling he wasn't going to like whatever it was. Lauren clasped his hands together in front of him and cracked a grin that made Blue reconsider punching him, because it couldn't make his punishment any worse than it looked like it was going to be. We have a special guest. I will not tell the council about what you did, if you are nice to him. With that, blue-purple light chased over Lauren's body and he disappeared, leaving a lingering outline of himself behind that faded as Blue glared at it. A special guest. More like a living hell to Blue. A week ago, he would have immediately thought Lauren was talking about King Thorn. But now there was only one male who roused Blue's anger and pain. There was only one male who Lauren would do anything to make sure that Blue was nice to, even resorting to setting Blue up so he could blackmail him into it.
What was that all about?
Taryn whispered from behind him. Blue huffed. Prince Vale is coming.